The world had heard rumors, whispered tales carried by fugitives and prisoners of war, but no one truly understood what waited beyond those barbed wire fences until the gates of Auschwitz were opened. What the soldiers found there was not a battlefield, nor a fortress, but a wound in the soul of humanity, a place where the light of civilization had been extinguished and replaced by the machinery of death. The liberation of Auschwitz was not merely the end of a camp, it was the moment when mankind was forced to confront what it was capable of doing to itself. For years the name Auschwitz had been known only to those who trembled under its shadow. Hidden behind electrified fences and the smoke of crematoriums, it was the largest of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, a complex of brick barracks, gas chambers, and watchtowers spread across the flatlands of occupied Poland. Over 1.3 million souls entered its gates. More than 1 million never came out. Men, women, and children from every corner of Europe. Jews, Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners, and countless others were transported there in crowded cattle cars, stripped of their names, and reduced to numbers tattooed in blue ink. In that world of ash and order, the concept of mercy did not exist. As the tide of war turned against Germany in 1944, the SS began erasing evidence of their crimes, burning documents and dismantling gas chambers. Yet their destruction could not outrun the truth. When Soviet scouts reached the outskirts of Auschwitz in late January 1945, they saw the smoke, the abandoned watchtowers, and the strange silence that cloaked the place. Inside the gates they found more than 7,000 prisoners, skeletal, diseased, barely alive, too weak to flee when the guards evacuated the rest toward the west in the infamous death marches. Around them lay piles of clothing, mountains of shoes, and tons of human hair packed into sacks. Every object, every smell, every whisper was proof of a crime so vast that even the liberators struggled to comprehend it. For the survivors, liberation was not a triumph but a haunting awakening. They walked out of Auschwitz not as victors but as remnants. Shadows of families erased, memories shattered, and bodies barely standing. Some wept, others simply stared at the snow falling through the broken gates, as if the world itself was too quiet to understand what it had allowed to happen. Soldiers who had marched through the ruins of cities and the carnage of battlefields were reduced to tears at the sight of what human cruelty had built in secret. Photographers raised their cameras, doctors tended to the living, and historians began collecting testimony because even then they knew what they had found must never be forgotten. The liberation of Auschwitz was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of remembrance. It revealed that evil had not just worn a uniform or followed orders, it had built a system, efficient and precise, that turned life into ash. The discovery of the camp would echo across the world, forcing nations, survivors, and future generations to ask how such darkness could exist among ordinary people. It was a moment when humanity stood on the edge of the abyss and vowed never to return. Yet the question lingers still: do we remember deeply enough? And do we recognize when the seeds of hatred begin to grow again? Tonight we journey back to that frozen gate, to the barbed wire, the broken chimneys, and the silent witnesses who remain. This is not merely a story of soldiers and survivors, but of conscience, memory, and the fragile light that flickered even in the darkest of nights. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The first light of January dawn spilled across the frozen plains of southern Poland, brushing frost-tipped roofs and skeletal trees with a pale, indifferent glow. Smoke curled from solitary chimneys, thin and hesitant against the chill that seeped into every corner of the villages. Snow crunched beneath the boots of retreating German soldiers, their faces drawn and eyes wary, scanning for threats that may never come. Wagons creaked and groaned under the weight of hurriedly loaded supplies, the scent of oil and burned wood lingering in the icy air. Dogs barked in distant yards, their cries swallowed by the silence of anticipation. From the barracks of the nearby camps, whispers moved like wind through barbed wire, prisoners listening, straining to catch any sound of movement beyond their fences, their breaths misted in the freezing air, hands trembling against the coarse fabric of their striped uniforms. Each day stretched longer than the last, time measured not in hours but in the rise and fall of distant muffled artillery. Shadows of officers moved across walls, plotting evacuations while hiding their own dread. An invisible tension hung in the village air, fragile and electric, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Beyond the village, the Red Army advanced slowly but inexorably, their columns glinting in the winter sun, iron and steel grinding against frozen ground. Soldiers, cloaked in layers of grey and white, trudged over hardened earth, their boots sinking into icy furrows. The distant roar of artillery rolled across the landscape, a low, omnipresent growl that pressed against the ears and lungs alike. Scouts moved ahead, rifles at the ready, eyes flicking to tree lines and ruined barns, searching for the slightest sign of resistance. Snowflakes drifted down, soft and silent, yet they muffled nothing of the grinding tension. Radio chatter crackled intermittently, words clipped, commands exchanged with urgent precision. Villagers peeked through frost-lined windows, hearts hammering in rhythm with the distant thunder. Every frozen pond, every shadowed grove, seemed pregnant with hidden movement. The soldiers pressed on, unaware of the full weight of the horrors awaiting them. The world felt small, compressed between frost and fire, yet enormous in consequence. Inside the camps, the prisoners moved with muted urgency, bodies attuned to the rhythms of fear, eyes flicked toward the horizon, scanning for dust clouds, the silhouette of distant vehicles, any signal that change was approaching. Whispers carried between barracks, names spoken softly, memories shared, attempts to anchor identity in a place designed to erase it. The smell of unwashed bodies mingled with the stench of smoke and lingering chemical tang from the factories beyond the fences. Some clutched one another in silent solidarity, while others kept a stoic distance, each breath a measured gamble. Frosted breath hung in the morning light, fragile as hope. Footsteps echoed from distant guard towers, deliberate and measured, but their rhythm could not mask the tremors in the ground. The prisoners felt time stretching, folding over itself, caught between yesterday's terror and tomorrow's unknown. Small gestures, a shared crust of bread, a whispered warning, carried immense weight in the stillness. In these moments the human spirit flickered stubbornly, fragile yet resilient against encroaching despair. The German commanders, their hands white on the wheel of fear, issued orders with clipped precision, but unease lingered in every gesture. Maps unfolded across wooden tables, inked lines tracing retreat and supply routes, each mark a reminder of imminent collapse. Guards shifted nervously, fingers brushing the straps of weapons, as if expecting the invisible enemy to appear at any moment. Fires were stoked hastily, both to cook and to destroy evidence, the smoke curling skyward like reluctant confessions. In the villages, farm animals stirred nervously, sensing disturbance, while children huddled closer to mothers, wide-eyed and silent. The officers spoke of evacuation, of erasing traces, of moving prisoners into the frozen void beyond. Yet behind every plan lay the tremor of uncertainty, the awareness that the Red Army's advance was unstoppable. Orders given with authority belied the fear that gripped each man behind the veneer of discipline. Each breath, each movement was a battle against the creeping dread that something irreversible was approaching. In the still rooms, paper rustled, boots scuffed, and history held its sharp, frozen edge. Snow-laden forests pressed in on the roads leading east, each tree a sentinel, each branch weighed down with frost and silence. Scouts in grey uniforms paused at intersections, ears straining for distant hums of movement, eyes scanning the pale horizon. Abandoned carts and broken fences marked the path of retreating villagers. Evidence of panic's quiet spread, smoke from distant chimneys mingled with gunpowder tang, lingering from skirmishes in earlier months. The crunch of frozen leaves underfoot, the creak of timber bending under snow, became part of an unspoken symphony of forewarning. Birds circled above, uneasy, their wings cutting sharp lines across the grey sky. From hidden bunkers, prisoners listened, counting beats, measuring time by the cadence of approaching danger. The land itself seemed to shiver, frost trembling along hedgerows, as if anticipating the coming storm. Each sound, each shadow was amplified in the winter hush. In these forests history waited, patient, inevitable, and merciless. Within the camp walls, small acts of observation became lifelines to sanity. Eyes traced the patterns of guards' patrols, the way sunlight reflected off distant fences, the occasional glint of boots on snow. Prisoners whispered about rumors of Soviet columns. Stories passed from one to another with cautious hope. The air was bitter and metallic, carrying both the smoke of burning evidence and the tang of human suffering. Frost clung to hair and clothing, stiffening movement, making each step deliberate and exhausting. Some wrote names and dates on scraps of paper, folding them carefully, hiding them as if the words themselves could preserve truth. Food rations, already scarce, became more precious than life itself, and the slightest gesture of sharing carried immense risk. The silence was thick, punctuated by coughs, distant shouts, the occasional bark of a dog. Every moment of waiting expanded into eternity, heavy with unspoken dread. And yet, even here, the human instinct for survival flickered quietly, stubborn against overwhelming darkness. In the villages beyond, farmers and townsfolk watched smoke trails and dust plumes, understanding instinctively that the war was approaching their doorsteps once more. Windows frosted over from inside, reflecting anxious eyes and tightly clenched fists. Carts loaded with meager belongings creaked over frozen ruts, carrying families whose destinies had narrowed to survival. The wind cut across open fields, sharp against exposed skin, carrying both frostbite and fear in equal measure. Soldiers passed in muted columns, their faces hard, yet revealing fatigue, the strain of retreat mixed with anticipation of engagement. Livestock huddled in pens, stamping hooves and bleating, a minor chaos against a backdrop of tense quiet. Snowflakes fell in slow spirals, each one catching in hair and fabric, a cold confetti for a war that had consumed millions. Even the forest whispered, branches scraping against one another as if recounting every step of the coming storm. Life continued, brittle and fragile, yet insistent, holding on to small gestures of normalcy. All around, the land waited, listening, as if it knew the approaching liberation would leave no corner untouched. By late morning, the horizon seemed to shift imperceptibly, the first glint of armored vehicles appearing between distant ridges. Prisoners pressed against walls, hoping for warmth, yet drawn to the fences as if magnets pulled by unseen forces. German officers barked commands, their tones sharp but hollow, carrying the weight of routines fraying at the edges. Smoke from small fires danced against the winter sun, casting distorted shadows across frozen earth and frozen hearts. Trees shook under the wind, scattering snow like whispered warnings across silent roads. Every crunch of snow underfoot, every distant shout seemed amplified, echoing through barracks and empty barns alike. The prisoners' senses stretched taut, absorbing detail, memorizing every flicker of movement. A quiet anticipation settled over the land, heavy with dread and fragile hope intertwined. and somewhere beyond the fences, the first true harbingers of change began to emerge, unstoppable and inexorable. In the silence of snow and smoke, an unspoken truth drifted eastward. The end of something terrible was approaching. The first shadows of evening stretched across the barbed wire and brick walls of Auschwitz, turning watchtowers into dark sentinels against the fading light. Chimneys rose like defiant fingers into a smoky, cold sky, the faint glow of fire within casting an ominous warmth that belied its deadly purpose. Soldiers' boots crunched against frost-hardened earth, echoing through courtyards emptied of all but echoes and fear. Inside the barracks, prisoners moved silently, their striped uniforms stiff with frost, and their limbs weakened by weeks of starvation. Smoke from hastily lit fires mingled with the acrid stench of burning paper, documents detailing atrocities reduced to ash before the approaching enemy. Each corner of the camp seemed meticulously organized for control, a grim choreography of terror. Gates and fences formed layers of containment, barbed wire cutting the sky like a frozen web. SS officers patrolled with sharp mechanical precision, their faces masks of authority concealing uncertainty. The bitter wind carried whispers of dread, threading through every corridor, every corner. In this place, fear was tangible. It clung to walls, to floors, to the very air. From above, the towers offered a vantage both strategic and terrifying. The silhouette of armed guards stark against the cold amber horizon. Spotlights swept in deliberate arcs, piercing the encroaching darkness, painting fleeting shadows on the snow-dusted ground below. Watchmen shifted, rifles clutched tightly, eyes scanning for the faintest sign of disturbance. Prisoners cowered behind wooden bunks, counting every footstep, listening for patterns that might signal reprieve or punishment. The metallic tang of gun oil blended with the sharp aroma of wood smoke, a sensory reminder of the machinery of oppression. Horses stamped in their pens, restless under the chill, their hooves muffled against frozen earth. The distant hum of train engines threaded through the still air, an ominous reminder of arrivals and departures orchestrated for death. Frost formed delicate, jagged patterns on window panes, reflecting the dim glow of guard lanterns. In quiet barracks, whispers of names, dates, and memories persisted, fragile against the weight of dread. The camp was alive in its silence, each shadow and sound a note in its mournful symphony. Crematoria chimneys belched dark plumes that drifted across the compound, a relentless signal of systematic destruction. Inside, furnaces glowed ominously, heat radiating through the surrounding brick, an infernal heartbeat beneath the cold winter sky. The rhythmic clank of metal doors opening and closing punctuated the air, each movement measured, precise, terrifying. Smoke mingled with the bitter aroma of burning human remains, lingering over snow that refused to absorb its memory. Guards moved through hallways, stamping authority with every step, their shadows stretching long and unforgiving. Prisoners, too weak to lift heads or hands, absorbed every detail of the mechanized horror around them. Ash sifted through the cracks in the floors, like winter snow inside the walls, settling over uniforms and wooden benches alike. Outside, the wind carried fragments of sound, a cough, a bark, a distant train whistle. In this place, the boundary between life and death had been stripped of ambiguity, stark and cruel. Every moment here was measured in survival, in silence, in observation. In offices lined with hastily stacked files, SS clerks moved with nervous urgency, tossing records into roaring fires. The scent of scorched paper rose, thick and acrid, while embers floated lazily toward the dim winter sky. Names, numbers, documents detailing systematic extermination vanished into smoke, leaving only the faintest echo of human accountability. Officers glanced over shoulders, aware of both external threats and internal collapse. Ink-stained fingers trembled as they scribbled last-minute orders, transferring prisoners, allocating work, erasing traces of evidence. The hum of radios, low and sporadic, punctuated the room's oppressive stillness, signaling reports and counter-orders. Frost seeped through gaps in walls and windows, chilling those who worked by firelight, adding a corporeal reminder of mortality. Each gesture, each hurried action, was laced with tension, urgency sharpened by the encroaching Red Army. In the silence of offices and barracks alike, dread became an omnipresent companion. The camp's machinery operated with precision, yet the human element quivered, vulnerable to the tide approaching. Patrols traced the perimeter with a relentless cadence, boots carving deep impressions in the frozen soil. Dogs strained against leashes, growling at the wind as if sensing its unseen menace. Guards' breaths formed white clouds, vanishing quickly into the bitter dusk. Ephemeral yet alive with intent. Prisoners pressed against walls, counting steps, timing routines, hoping small observations might provide a fragile advantage. Fences hummed faintly in the cold, taut wires vibrating under tension, a quiet testament to control. Smoke from distant chimneys illuminated snowflakes that swirled like silent warnings through the air. Shadows danced along walls, elongated and distorted by lamplight, a grotesque choreography of fear. Inside wooden bunks, whispers told stories of home, of lost families, of impossible hope. Each day blurred into the next, measured in the sound of boots, the crackle of fire, the distant hum of approaching conflict. The camp itself seemed to breathe, deliberate, calculating, relentless. Prisoners peered from narrow windows and gaps in walls, eyes tracing the skyline where darkness met frozen earth. The pale light caught on frost and iron alike, painting a world half real, half nightmare. Every sound, every shadow, every shift of smoke carried meaning, signaling danger or brief reprieve. Hunger gnawed, but fear consumed more deeply, a constant presence beneath every movement. The metallic clang of doors echoed like judgment, punctuating the muted whispers of the weak. Cold seeped into bones, unrelenting, matching the emotional chill that hung heavier than any winter wind. Soldiers moved methodically, their gestures rehearsed, almost ceremonial, a deadly ballet that left no room for error. Small fires flickered along barracks, throwing long, trembling shadows across frost-coated floors. Even the air seemed thick, heavy with anticipation, as if waiting for the inevitable fracture. In every corner, the machinery of death loomed, silent, patient, unyielding. Beyond the fences, train tracks stretched toward the horizon, carrying the cargo of human lives with grim precision. Wheels rattled over iron, a steady, relentless percussion that resonated through snow and stone alike. The smell of coal smoke mingled with frozen earth and distant forest, a bitter perfume marking the passage of fate. Soldiers guided transports with exacting routines, their faces impassive masks, yet the tension beneath them was palpable. Prisoners, seated and silent, traced the landscape with hollow eyes, absorbing the muted signals of survival. Frost clung to hair, clothing, and hope alike, each flake a reminder of the world outside that had almost ceased to exist. Guards barked commands, voices slicing the cold, echoing off distant walls. In the barracks, fragile alliances formed, whispered strategies and observations that might hold life for another day. Snow fell softly, a silent witness to every journey, every death, every trembling heartbeat. The camp was a fortress, but even fortresses breathe, and its walls creaked under the weight of approaching history. Night settled like a velvet shroud over Auschwitz, cloaking towers, fences and chimneys in muted grey. Lanterns flickered along walls, casting shadows that stretched into corners, twisting and bending with the cold wind. Frost rimmed each edge, crystallizing sound and light into a brittle, fragile reality. The distant hum of trains slowed into night, yet the memory of movement lingered, a pulse beneath the stillness. Guards paced tirelessly, eyes scanning darkness, hearts thumping in rhythm with the weight of responsibility and fear. Inside barracks, prisoners shivered under thin blankets, clinging to warmth and fleeting hope alike. Fires glowed low, illuminating faces gaunt with hunger, etched with quiet defiance and disbelief. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying both evidence of atrocity and the faint scent of survival. Even in rest, the camp's machinery remained alive, a relentless presence in every creaking floorboard, every frozen wire. The camp stood like a fortress of shadows, both crumbling and unyielding, waiting for history to break its gates. The first grey light of dawn spread over the frozen plains of Upper Silesia, illuminating a landscape stripped bare by months of retreat and devastation. In command tents, maps were unfurled on wooden tables, inked lines tracing rivers, towns, and German positions with meticulous care. Officers leaned over them, fingers tapping and tracing routes, calculating every risk in silence. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and cold wool mingled, heavy and tangible, pressing on the senses. Outside, columns of T-34 tanks ground forward through snow, their tracks carving deep ruts into the frozen earth. Artillery units erupted intermittently, flashes of orange and smoke punctuating the pale morning light. Radio operators relayed terse updates, their voices clipped, precise, carrying both urgency and authority. Soldiers tightened straps, adjusted helmets, and exhaled clouds of frost as their breath mingled with the cold air. The land itself seemed to shiver beneath the weight of mechanized advance, as if anticipating the change to come. Step by step, the machinery of the Red Army moved, relentless, unstoppable, inexorable. In villages along the approach, wooden homes sat abandoned, their windows shattered, doors swinging open on rusted hinges. The wind carried the scent of burned wood, spoiled food, and lingering fear, a ghostly testimony to months of German occupation. Scouts moved cautiously ahead, rifles ready, scanning frozen fields and empty streets for ambush or trap. Horses once harnessed to carts now stamped nervously in abandoned stables, nostrils flaring in the biting cold. Smoke from distant chimneys belched faintly, a deceptive sign of life in an otherwise silent expanse. Soldiers in long grey coats trudged over snow and ice, their movements measured, each step consuming energy in the bitter frost. Shellfire rattled in the distance, a low, rolling thunder that vibrated through bone and soil alike. Crows circled above, uneasy, wings beating against the chill, carrying the smell of carrion and ash. Farmers' fences, broken and bent, marked the line between villages and open fields, a fragile boundary in a landscape under siege. Momentum gathered, invisible yet tangible, pushing forward toward the distant horizon of conflict. Tank engines rumbled in synchronized cadence, metal groaning under stress and frozen grease. Tracks ground against ice, leaving parallel scars that stretched toward the horizon, deep and unbroken. Snow flew in plumes with each turn, scattering like frozen sparks into the pale air. Commanders shouted terse instructions over wind and gunfire, voices sharp, cutting through the low drone of machinery. Soldiers clutched weapons, eyes scanning tree lines and distant ridges, muscles taut with anticipation. Smoke from artillery shells rose in curling ribbons, twisting skyward against the weak light. The scent of oil and gunpowder merged with frost, filling lungs with a metallic, biting tang. Each vehicle carried not just men but momentum, the raw energy of an advancing tide. Trenches and foxholes lined the edges of fields, silent reminders of resistance that had long since melted away. Across the frozen plains, motion became purpose, and purpose became inevitability. Inside command tents, maps and charts detailed every river crossing, bridge, and village along the route to Auschwitz. Officers bent over them, plotting attack vectors, calculating artillery ranges, and marking fallback points in pencil and ink. Cigarette smoke hung thick, curling around lamps and flickering oil lanterns, blending with the scent of paper and cold wool. A young radio operator adjusted frequencies, listening to distant chatter, the static punctuated by coded instructions. Outside, snow continued to fall, light and crystalline, blanketing the ground, yet unable to silence the hum of tanks and machinery. Officers murmured over photographs of enemy positions, the faces of German soldiers frozen in black and white. Frost collected on edges of tent flaps, forming delicate crystals that shattered when touched. The air vibrated with anticipation, a quiet tension more oppressive than gunfire. Every calculation, every adjustment carried the weight of thousands of lives and countless unknown consequences. Through meticulous planning and disciplined execution, the red tide pressed inexorably forward. Artillery units positioned on distant ridges waited for the signal, barrels gleaming faintly against the pale horizon. The first shells erupted in synchronized arcs, spitting smoke and fire across snow-covered fields. The concussion rattled teeth and shook frozen earth, sending plumes of snow and dirt into the sky. Soldiers ducked instinctively, faces tight with focus, ears ringing from the echoing thunder. Officers marked impacts, adjusting angles and distances with methodical precision, a deadly science in the frozen landscape. The scent of sulfur and burnt powder clung to hair, clothing, and the air itself. Villagers, long abandoned, would later recount these distant booms as a strange, unnatural rolling of the earth. Even the forest seemed to shudder, branches scraping together in sympathy or fear. Each salvo reshaped the land, hollowing out space, carving avenues of advance and zones of destruction. The Red Army's momentum carried not just men but inevitability itself across the plains. Scouts advanced along frozen rivers, moving cautiously over ice that groaned under weight and temperature. Reflections of steel helmets glinted in shallow water trapped beneath snow, a ghostly shimmer beneath the grey light. Wolves, hidden in distant tree lines, lifted heads and howled, their cries echoing like warnings across empty fields. Soldiers pressed on, rifles ready, boots crunching in quiet, deliberate rhythm over frost-hardened earth. Every ridge and hollow was scanned for ambushes, mines, or hidden pockets of resistance. Smoke from burning farmhouses drifted lazily, a muted, sinister haze marking recent skirmishes. The wind cut across frozen cheeks, forcing breath into clouds of mist that quickly dissolved. Frost clung to leather straps and canvas, stiffening gear and hands alike, a constant reminder of the harsh environment. Scouts signaled back to the main column, gestures precise, rehearsed, unbroken by emotion. Each movement forward felt inevitable, calculated, yet alive with the tension of the unknown. Behind advancing columns, supply trains followed, wheels crunching over icy tracks, carrying shells, food, and fuel. Horses strained in harnesses, metal hooves striking frozen ground, echoing through empty valleys and abandoned roads. Soldiers maintained discipline, rationing warmth and food, their faces drawn and pale beneath layers of grey fabric. The smell of sweat mixed with oil, frost, and distant smoke, a bitter cocktail of human exertion and mechanical effort. Officers made constant calculations, adjusting routes and schedules, aware that momentum could falter without careful orchestration. Columns of tanks moved in measured cadence, each engine groaning as it climbed over ice and mud alike. Snow-dusted helmets and gear masking shapes and adding quiet camouflage against observation from afar. In quiet moments between movement, soldiers caught glimpses of villages and forests, landscapes frozen yet brimming with unseen life. The plain itself seemed to pulse with motion, the very ground vibrating under armored weight. The tide of men, machines, and resolve surged forward, unstoppable, relentless, and patient. By late afternoon, smoke and frost merged along the horizon, painting a landscape of cold chaos and structured precision. The sun, pale and wan, cast long shadows over trenches, frozen fields, and advancing columns alike. Soldiers adjusted positions, artillery recalibrated, and scouts relayed fresh intelligence with clipped efficiency. Snow swirled in small cyclones, glinting like fractured glass as it caught the remaining light. Tanks and infantry moved as one organism, each part knowing its place, each motion carrying the purpose of many thousands. Wolves howled from distant woods, mingling with the faint rumble of engines, a wild counterpoint to the disciplined advance. Exhausted men paused briefly, shaking snow from coats, wiping sweat from frozen faces, counting time in measured breaths. Each step carried the weight of strategy, history, and lives unseen yet inexorably impacted. Momentum surged forward, unbroken, unrelenting, as if the landscape itself bent to the will of the advancing tide. Step by step, field by frozen field, the storm of the east rolled toward the barbed horizon. Frost clung to the camp's barbed wire as orders crackled across radio lines in German barracks, urgent and clipped. Officers paced in heated corridors, faces pale beneath the glare of oil lamps, voices tight with panic. Documents detailing the mechanics of genocide were torn from files, thrown into roaring fires, their smoke curling toward the icy ceiling. Prisoners shuffled uneasily, sensing tension, their hollow eyes tracking every hurried movement. The metallic tang of gun oil and scorched paper filled the air, mingling with the bitter scent of unwashed clothing and sweat. Horses stamped nervously in pens outside, nostrils flaring, ears twitching at every sound. Frost formed along window ledges, glinting like shattered glass, while shadows danced across walls in distorted shapes. SS officers barked orders with increasing desperation, gesturing toward gates, trucks, and assembly points. Each step, each movement carried the weight of impending collapse and chaotic urgency. In the camp, the air vibrated with a tension so sharp it cut through the cold. Along frozen roads, columns of prisoners were herded into death marches, bodies weak, limbs trembling under the strain of exhaustion. Snow crunched underfoot, the sound magnified in the eerie quiet of pre-dawn winter. Guards yelled, striking with batons, rifles swinging from gloved shoulders, faces twisted into masks of authority and fear. Every mile carried the echo of human fragility, feet sinking into frost-laden earth, breath visible in ragged clouds. Some prisoners stumbled, collapsing into the snow, only to be prodded forward with cold precision. Trees loomed like silent witnesses, skeletal branches scraping the grey sky, dripping ice like a slow, inexorable countdown. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and the faint copper tang of blood from bruises and frostbite. Distance blurred villages into pale smudges, witnesses to the mechanized cruelty passing through. Even the wind seemed to carry judgment, biting exposed skin with merciless insistence. In this moving hell, every step marked both survival and the relentless erasure of life. Inside command rooms, radio operators transmitted rapid updates, their voices shaking despite practiced discipline. Maps were pored over, lines tracing evacuation routes, crossing bridges, frozen rivers, and broken roads. Officers argued briefly, voices tense, pointing at columns of prisoners, machinery, and retreating German units. Smoke from burning records spiraled through vents, carrying the scent of charred paper and ash that hung heavy in the cold rooms. Frost crept along walls and ceilings, tiny crystals scattering light over trembling hands. The hum of generators, guns, and distant artillery underscored the chaos, a mechanical heartbeat to orchestrated panic. Clerks rifled through papers, discarding names, lists, and schedules with frantic efficiency, trying to outrun history itself. Boots thudded across hallways, echoed, multiplied, amplified intense cadence, marking the passage of time. Windows rattled with the wind, their panes vibrating like nervous hearts beneath lamplight. Every action, every frantic gesture betrayed the fear that the coming storm would expose everything. Outside, trucks waited in lines, engines idling, exhaust curling into the frozen morning air. Guards shouted orders, their voices harsh, slicing through fog and frost alike, corralling prisoners toward the vehicles. Horses stamped, metal chains clanging against harnesses, hooves digging into frozen ground with effort. The smell of oil, leather, and unwashed bodies merged into a bitter, heavy haze that hung over the courtyard. Some prisoners stumbled, falling into snowdrifts, coughing, shivering, their eyes wide with disbelief. Officers gestured impatiently, urging movement, their gloves slick with sweat and frost. Snowflakes clung to hair and clothing, a delicate contrast to the brutality moving through the camp. Every engine, every vehicle became a symbol of both displacement and destruction. In the distance, distant artillery fire hummed low, vibrating through earth and bone alike. Momentum surged in cold, methodical waves, mechanical, efficient yet human in its tremor of panic. Death marches stretched for miles, prisoners' feet leaving deep impressions in ice and snow that would vanish with the next storm. Trees scraped against frozen sky, limbs brittle, casting distorted shadows across the trudging lines. Soldiers barked commands over the wind, rifles swinging, boots crunching, batons striking. Exhaustion etched faces, hollowing cheeks and hollow eyes, while frost rimmed every brow and collar. The air carried smoke from distant fires, the faint acrid taste of ash lingering on lips. Villages passed silently, doors shuttered, windows frosted, residents aware but helpless to intervene. Some prisoners whispered hurried prayers, their voices caught and broken by the cold and fear. Even the ground seemed indifferent, frozen and unyielding, marking each step with silent witness. The landscape itself became a participant, every tree, ridge, and snowdrift a stage for human desperation. In this relentless march, survival and erasure intertwined with every crunch of frozen earth. Back inside barracks, officers burned evidence in improvised pits, embers casting flickering orange light across stone floors. Names, records, and photographs vanished, their smoke coiling into the night sky, a grim signal of both secrecy and guilt. Hands gloved in leather or wrapped in scarves trembled as papers were fed into flames, small sparks scattering over frost-streaked boards. The air vibrated with urgency, punctuated by shouted commands and the mechanical clatter of tools and typewriters. Outside, the march continued, each mile removing the past from immediate sight, yet leaving its imprint in exhaustion and blood. Frost collected on hair, weapons and clothing alike, a silent witness to the frenzy of erasure. Soldiers moved with rigid discipline, masking panic beneath routines practiced countless times. The smell of smoke, sweat, and frozen earth combined, suffocating, heavy, a sensory weight impossible to ignore. Even in this confined chaos, fear had texture, pressing against walls, ceilings, and frozen floors. Every flicker of light from the fire illuminated the tension, a fleeting glimpse into the collapse of control. Prisoners stumbled across roads lined with skeletal trees, each step a negotiation with pain, frostbite, and fatigue. Some collapsed entirely, unable to continue, dragged forward by guards or left behind to the indifferent snow. The cold penetrated deep into bones, mingling with hunger and the psychological strain of constant fear. Snowflakes landed on lashes, eyelashes frozen together, forming fragile crystalline masks over hollow faces. Dogs lunged, barking, teeth gleaming, against the soft murmur of human suffering. Officers shouted over wind and distance, gestures sharp, breath misting in the cold air. Each column moved mechanically like cogs in a cruel machine, momentum unbroken despite exhaustion. Distant hills glimmered under muted light, markers of distance yet to be covered. The earth beneath groaned under weight and movement, frozen yet yielding, recording every footprint. With every step the human cost mounted, yet the machinery of panic and erasure pressed on. By late afternoon, smoke still curled from pits and barracks, acrid and persistent, carrying the scent of desperation. Prisoners huddled in brief moments of reprieve, catching breath, eyes wide, ears straining for commands or reprieve. Guards patrolled with increased vigilance, eyes darting toward trees, fences, and the horizon, alert to any threat. Frost glistened on every surface, softening sound but never masking the tension vibrating through the air. Reports crackled over radios, brief, urgent, detailing movements, numbers and gaps, each update amplifying the officer's panic. The weight of impending liberation pressed against the camp like a slow, unyielding tide. Prisoners counted time in breaths, heartbeats, steps, the landscape around them, a cruel measure of endurance. Each action of the SS betrayed growing fear, their rituals of destruction now frantic, jagged, imperfect. Snow swirled in spirals around boots, columns, and smoke, a quiet accompaniment to the chaos. In their desperation to hide the crime, the architects of Auschwitz revealed its vastness. The first light of dawn revealed a landscape cloaked in frost and silence, broken only by the slow shuffle of prisoners along snowbound roads. Their feet sank into the frozen earth, leaving deep, uneven impressions that stretched for miles, a fragile record of human suffering. Faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, breaths misting in the bitter morning air as cold wind cut through threadbare uniforms. Guards barked commands, rifles swinging, boots pounding in rhythm against the frost-hardened ground. Some prisoners stumbled, falling into snowdrifts, hands clawing at ice and earth, only to be dragged forward with mechanical cruelty. The smell of frozen sweat, damp wool, and fear clung to the air, mingling with the faint tang of blood from bruises and frostbite. Distant forests stood as silent witnesses, skeletal trees scraping grey sky with frost-laden limbs. Villagers watched from behind shuttered windows, faces pale, eyes wide, hearts pounding with helpless grief. Horses used for supply trailed behind, stamping impatiently in the snow, exhaling clouds of warm vapor. Step by step the human tide moved forward, fragile yet inexorably forced onward by violence and fear. Along narrow village lanes the columns stretched endlessly, a living river of exhaustion and despair. Some prisoners leaned heavily on one another, whispering names and small prayers that dissolved into the wind. The crunch of frozen footprints echoed through empty streets, amplified by the rigid silence of those watching. Frost formed on eyelashes, stiffening them, while cheeks burned red from cold and exertion. Dogs barked in distant yards, their voices swallowed by the low murmur of boots and the occasional crack of a whip. Guards shouted incessantly, voices sharp, splitting the quiet air into fragments of terror. Snowflakes clung to hair, uniforms, and exposed skin, delicate against the harsh brutality around them. Fields flanking the road were white and endless, offering no refuge, no concealment from the relentless march. Some prisoners collapsed, their bodies left by the roadside, small, fragile shapes against the vast frozen landscape. The journey continued, a ceaseless testament to suffering measured in frozen breaths and aching limbs. As the day wore on, the sun remained pale, casting long shadows over the columns, stretching human shapes into grotesque silhouettes. Prisoners' lips were cracked, eyes bloodshot, hands raw from gripping frozen sticks or fabric. Each step became an endurance test, muscles screaming, hearts thudding in rhythm with exhaustion. Guards walked alongside, batons swinging, rifles pressed lightly but with lethal intent. The wind cut across faces, sharp and merciless, forcing each breath to emerge in painful clouds. Snow drifted across abandoned carts, broken fences and distant villages, masking tracks yet failing to erase traces of human torment. From hidden farmhouses, eyes followed the passing columns, faces etched with grief, hands clenched tight against doors and walls. Horses and supply wagons struggled through frozen ruts, their metal fittings biting into ice. The muffled groans of the weak and fallen were swallowed by the white expanse, echoing only faintly back to those still marching. Every mile became a measure of endurance, despair, and the inexorable force of human cruelty. In small forests along the route, shadows of soldiers moved in coordination, scanning tree lines and clearings for anyone attempting escape. The muffled sound of footsteps, uneven and labored, filled the otherwise silent woodland corridors. Wolves, hidden in distant tree lines, lifted heads, ears twitching. Their cries carried faintly on the cold wind. Some prisoners whispered frantic instructions to each other, small gestures of survival against impossible odds. Snow clung to collars and hair, creating fragile halos of frost in the pale light. Guards' boots sank into snow, leaving firm, deliberate impressions alongside the fragile marks of the exhausted. Frozen rivers, thin yet unyielding, became barriers to navigate, forcing careful steps and deadly calculation. The air smelled of smoke from distant burning fields, mingling with human sweat and icy earth. Frost-bitten fingers fumbled with whatever meager belongings remained, clutching letters, scraps, or photographs. Each step through trees, each careful crossing of frozen ground, was punctuated by grief and the weight of inevitable mortality. Villagers watched silently as columns passed, faces pressed to frost-covered panes, children trembling beside mothers, sensing the cruelty yet unable to intervene. The silence was almost sacred, a collective mourning for those who could not resist the march. Footsteps ground into snow, leaving parallel scars for memory, markers of lives being stripped away. Collapsed prisoners littered the roadside, sometimes dragged by guards, sometimes left to vanish into whiteness. The wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying cries, coughs and groans, a choir of grief against the frozen landscape. Guards barked orders that dissolved into the wind almost as soon as they were spoken. Horses and wagons plodded behind, carrying supplies and exhaustion in equal measure. Frost coated the ground, the uniforms, and the human expressions of suffering, glinting in fleeting sunlight. Villagers averted their eyes, hands pressed to mouths, hearts heavy with helpless sorrow. The columns pressed onward, relentless, each step a painful testament to the endurance and fragility of human life. Snow deepened as the day fell into evening, turning roads into slippery ribbons that tested balance and willpower alike. Prisoners clung to one another, forming small chains of survival, murmuring encouragements in whispers fragile and fleeting. Guards' voices were harsh, cutting through the cold, but trembling faintly with fatigue or panic. Horses snorted and pawed at the frozen earth, restless and aware of the human suffering surrounding them. Ice collected along jackets, collars and boots, adding weight to every movement, every step a battle against both terrain and despair. The smell of frost, sweat and distant smoke combined into a suffocating haze, oppressive and heavy. Villages receded into the distance, small squares of light swallowed by the vast white expanse. Fallen prisoners lay still, eyes open, breaths shallow or absent, witnesses to the cruelty of forced march. Trees bent under snow, cracking occasionally, their sound startling in the near silence. Each hour of movement became a measure of grief, endurance, and the relentless passage of mortality. Night approached, grey and suffocating, wrapping the columns in muted, oppressive shadows. Exhausted bodies sank deeper into the snow, their breath shallow clouds drifting into darkness. Frost rimmed every boot, uniform, and exposed limb, glinting faintly in lantern light or distant moon glow. Guards shouted instructions intermittently, rifles swinging, batons cutting through the heavy air, tension thick as smoke. The wind whispered across open plains, carrying echoes of groans, faint prayers, and the hollow silence of those left behind. Villagers observed from a distance, faces pale, hearts heavy, the spectacle of human suffering etched into memory. Horses exhaled warm clouds that quickly dissipated into the frozen night, unaware of the human torment around them. Footsteps crunched in rhythm, uneven but relentless, marking the passage of grief through landscape and snow. Every mile traversed etched deeper into memory, leaving impressions that would never fade. For many, liberation would never come. Their journey ended in snowbound silence. The camp lay quiet now, a frozen husk after the hurried evacuations, its fences sagging and gates swinging gently in the bitter wind. In the barracks, a faint haze of smoke drifted from small fires, the only warmth for bodies too weak to rise. Children huddled together on straw-strewn floors, shivering, eyes wide and uncomprehending, clutching one another like fragile anchors. The metallic tang of illness mingled with the lingering stench of unwashed clothing, a persistent reminder of human fragility. Empty bunks creaked under the weight of the frail, mattresses stained and damp, yet providing small comfort against the frost creeping through gaps. Guards had fled or vanished, leaving silence punctuated only by distant echoes of collapsing wood and the wind through broken windows. Frost glazed the window panes, catching the pale sunlight and scattering it across gaunt faces, illuminating suffering in sharp relief. Every breath was laborious, shallow, visible as thin clouds that dissolved almost immediately into the cold air. Even the walls seemed to lean inward, heavy with memory, oppressive yet protective in their stillness. Among these shadows, life persisted in its quietest, most fragile form, waiting, hoping, trembling. Makeshift hospital huts contained the sickest of the survivors, narrow rooms filled with moans, rattles, and coughs that punctuated the silence. Straw mats on the cold floors offered little relief, each body curled tightly against frost, exhaustion, or fever. Medical supplies were scarce, improvised bandages and diluted disinfectants scavenged from abandoned stores, applied with trembling hands. Children too small to understand the full horror clung to mothers or siblings, seeking warmth, reassurance, or a semblance of safety. The smell of antiseptic mixed unevenly with decay, unwashed bodies, and lingering smoke, creating a pungent reminder of mortality. Every groan, every rattling cough, echoed like a drumbeat across empty corridors. Officers' absence left both order and oversight dissolved, replaced by quiet, strained cooperation among the few able-bodied prisoners. Frost crept along roof beams and window edges, scattering crystalline light over pale faces. Even in despair, quiet gestures persisted. An offered sip of water, a tucked blanket, a gentle murmur of encouragement. In these rooms, fragility became tangible, almost visible, hovering in the air like smoke. Outside the infirmary, courtyards were littered with the weakest, unable to march or hide, sprawled in uneven lines across frost-crusted earth. The wind cut sharply across their exposed forms, forcing shallow, ragged breaths that condensed into ghostly clouds. Fingers stiffened with frost-clutched clothing, or meager belongings, desperate to preserve something human against the eroding cold. Wooden benches offered minimal support, yet provided a fragile sense of rest for the bodies too feeble to stand. The faint clatter of falling ice or shifting debris echoed across the compound, startling those half asleep in the open. A lone horse, abandoned or left behind, stamped nervously nearby, nostrils flaring in the frigid air. The smell of earth, frost and lingering ash combined, a bitter perfume marking absence and abandonment. Small fires, flickering, struggled to provide warmth, casting long, trembling shadows across gaunt faces. Every movement was labored, deliberate, as if conserving life itself required calculation. In this stark stillness, the weakest endured, silent witnesses to both horror and survival. Corridors and stairwells were filled with lingering shadows, the survivors' eyes tracking every shift of light and movement. Even the faintest sound, a footstep, a falling icicle, a distant groan, elicited flinches and tightened muscles. Frost formed along edges of door frames and banisters, sparkling like shards of memory over worn wood. Small groups huddled together, exchanging whispers of what remained, fragments of hope, names, and familiar faces. The metallic tang of human exhaustion lingered, mingling with dust and smoke, a potent reminder of the cost endured. Makeshift crutches and splints leaned against walls, the remnants of improvised care for broken limbs. Every corner, every shadow seemed alive with observation, as if the camp itself mourned the absence of order. Windows rattled softly in the wind, a fragile percussion against the heavy silence. Even animals, birds or stray dogs, moved cautiously, sensing both human fragility and the emptiness of the landscape. Each room, hallway, and stairwell carried weight and memory, a delicate testimony to endurance. In hidden corners, some prisoners had carved niches, small spaces beneath collapsed beams or within hollow walls, offering scant refuge. Their eyes darted, tracking the long shadows cast by the low winter sun, muscles tense, every nerve alert. Hunger gnawed deeply, yet fear of exposure and vulnerability weighed heavier, an invisible shackle. Frosted breath rose from mouths, lingering in the air like fragile whispers of life itself. Children pressed against one another, shaking, murmuring fragmented words, drawing warmth from human proximity. Makeshift blankets, rags, and layers of clothing offered minimal insulation, yet each shivering body clung to these tokens desperately. Every crack of timber, every distant sound of ice breaking felt magnified, a potential harbinger of danger. The camp's silence was punctuated only by whispers, coughs, and the occasional shuffle of weak limbs. Even the faintest spark of movement required effort, a testament to enduring will. In these hidden spaces, survival became a delicate balance between life and collapse. Some corridors retained vestiges of SS authority, empty guard posts, scattered papers, abandoned rifles leaning against walls. Their presence haunted the rooms, an invisible imprint of terror and control. Prisoners passed cautiously, touching walls, checking corners, lingering only as long as necessary to preserve energy. Frost formed intricate patterns on exposed surfaces, catching pale light and scattering it across the gaunt figures. Every discarded uniform, boot, and helmet told stories of absence, abandonment, and hurried departure. The smell of smoke lingered, traces of fires meant to erase records or human lives persisting in cold air. Windows reflected pale sun, frost crystals, magnifying lines etched on faces by exhaustion, hunger, and illness. Even the structural decay of walls and ceilings seemed amplified, emphasizing fragility and vulnerability. Movements were quiet, deliberate, almost reverent as prisoners navigated a camp both abandoned and haunted. Survival now relied on vigilance, patience, and the faintest whispers of strength. Outside, the open courtyards bore silent testimony to those left behind, bodies curled into frost, blankets barely protecting from the wind. Children clung to older prisoners, their small hands trembling, eyes wide, hearts beating rapidly against chests. Makeshift fires sputtered weakly, smoke trailing in thin ribbons toward grey skies, their warmth barely penetrating bone-deep cold. The occasional moan or cough echoed unnervingly across the still compound, carrying weight far beyond the sound itself. Frost glinted on hair, clothing, and exposed skin, scattering light across faces drawn taut with suffering. Doors swung on broken hinges, creaking softly, adding subtle music to the fragile scene. Animals moved cautiously, sniffing the frozen ground, aware of the human presence yet unwilling to approach. Each breath was measured, a struggle, a testament to enduring fragility. Snow crunched faintly under weak movements, marking time and space with delicate traces of survival. In the vast quiet, the remaining prisoners waited, suspended between hope and uncertainty, shadows of endurance in a fractured world. By evening, silence had deepened into near-complete stillness, punctuated only by faint breathing, shifting blankets, or the occasional rattle of distant debris. Frost rimmed every surface, softening sound but not masking the tension lingering in corners and corridors. Children rested against one another, fragile bodies drawing warmth from shared proximity, eyes wide in cautious vigilance. The smell of smoke, damp straw, and unwashed clothing lingered, heavy and persistent. Even in this apparent calm, muscles remained tense, ready for movement that might not be possible. Makeshift fires glowed weakly, casting long, trembling shadows across gaunt faces and thin blankets. Every sound, even the faintest creak of timber or drip of melting ice, carried weight, signaling danger or the possibility of rescue. The camp, abandoned and fragile, held these remaining souls in a frozen, suspended state. Outside, night fell, spreading darkness across frost and ruin, quiet but immense. In the stillness of abandonment, the weakest waited, not knowing if rescue or ruin would arrive first. Dawn crept over the frozen woods surrounding Auschwitz, pale light filtering through skeletal trees dusted with frost. Soviet scouts moved cautiously, boots crunching softly on snow, rifles held at the ready, eyes scanning every shadow. The wind carried the scent of pine, smoke from distant fires, and the faint metallic tang of abandoned machinery. Barbed wire emerged slowly from the fog, glinting like cruel teeth, a silent sentinel marking the boundary of the unknown. Occasionally, a broken fence post groaned under frost and age, startling nerves taut with anticipation. Birds lifted in sudden silent bursts, scattering across pale sky, adding ephemeral motion to the stillness. Each step forward was deliberate, measured, as though the snow itself demanded caution. Frost clung to eyelashes, gloves, and gun barrels, glinting like shattered glass under the weak sun. The quiet was oppressive, amplifying the smallest sound, a snapping branch, a distant thump, the scuff of boot against ice. Every movement brought the scouts closer to an unprepared truth, tension coiling around each heartbeat. The first abandoned guard posts appeared through the mist, doors ajar, rifles left leaning against walls in silent testimony to the SS retreat. Inside, the scent of decay, damp wood, and lingering smoke hung thick, heavy with absence and fear. Footsteps echoed softly, a measured percussion against frozen wooden floors, disturbing dust motes that shimmered in pale light. Officers' charts, maps, and scattered papers were left behind, fluttering faintly in drafty corridors. Frosted windows fragmented the weak sunlight into a kaleidoscope over gaunt, empty bunks and splintered floors. Every corner revealed evidence of sudden flight, footprints ending abruptly, discarded boots or half-packed bags. The scouts moved slowly, cataloguing, observing, cautious of traps yet driven by the need for reconnaissance. Outside, snow shifted under wind and animal movement, each noise magnified against the still landscape. Broken lanterns, blackened by soot, leaned askew, signaling the camp's hasty abandonment. In the quiet of these empty posts, suspense thickened, a living thing palpable in the air. Through narrow gaps in trees, the scouts glimpsed the outer perimeters, barbed wire stretching in irregular lines across frozen ground. The wire sparkled under frost, its twisted metal casting long, ominous shadows across white expanses. Scattered watchtowers leaned precariously, windows broken, ladders warped by frost and neglect. The wind carried faint echoes, distant groans, the rustle of discarded clothing, the faint clatter of shifting debris. Snowflakes clung to the scouts' uniforms, softening motion, muffling sound, yet highlighting each movement in crystalline detail. Each patrol member's breath rose in white clouds, mingling with smoke from distant fires, carrying both cold and tension. In the underbrush, foxes and small wildlife stirred cautiously, aware of the silent intruders passing through their domain. Every snap of twig, every distant hollow sound heightened the sense of suspense, a quiet anticipation of revelation. Eyes scanned fences, huts and paths, noting angles, weaknesses, and patterns of abandonment. Step by step, the scouts drew closer to the heart of the camp, unprepared for what awaited beyond the wire. A sudden clearing revealed the first glimpse of the barracks. Long rows of wooden structures standing like monuments to absence. Frost-rimmed rooftops, forming delicate halos over gabled edges, glinting in pale light. Chimneys rose like silent sentinels, emitting only faint smoke that hinted at life, extinguished but recently present. The scouts paused, rifles lowered slightly, absorbing the scale of emptiness and decay. Broken doors hung on rusted hinges, swaying slightly in a subtle breeze that carried distant echoes of human suffering. Snow shifted across courtyards, revealing impressions of hurried departures, footprints, discarded possessions, and half-burned papers. Every detail was magnified under scrutiny, the mind racing to reconstruct events from fragile traces. The cold air seemed heavier here, burdened with history, absence, and the weight of atrocities recently enacted. Shadows moved within frost-laden corners, deceiving perception, heightening the sense of suspense. In this sudden clearing, the scouts realized the camp's silence was not peace. It was a waiting, pregnant with revelation. As they approached the inner fences, the scouts noted subtle signs of life, thin smoke rising from hidden corners, the faint movement of ragged figures. Children, frail and pale, peered from the shadows of collapsed barracks, wide eyes reflecting both fear and curiosity. The scouts froze instinctively, aware of the fragility before them, every nerve heightened in the frost-thick air. Abandoned tools, broken carts, and scattered belongings suggested haste, improvisation, and the human instinct to survive. Frost collected on rifles, binoculars, and helmets, sparkling in the muted light as scouts advanced cautiously. The wind carried low groans and coughs, fragmented yet distinct, signaling the living amidst the empty structures. Each breath became audible, rising in thin clouds, blending with smoke, frost, and tension. Every step, every careful movement weighed against the risk of exposure, misstep, or alarm. Observing from the undergrowth, the soldiers realized the scale of human endurance trapped within these structures. Suspense coiled tightly, as if the camp itself awaited their crossing of the final threshold. The scouts found remnants of hurried destruction, papers scorched or torn, blankets scorched or left crumpled, rifles abandoned against walls. The smell of smoke lingered, faint yet stubborn, mixing with frost and the metallic tang of abandoned equipment. Small animals moved cautiously, disrupting the fragile silence, ears pricked, tails stiff in anticipation. Broken windows reflected pale light across gaunt faces, glimpsed fleetingly from dark corners. Officers' meticulous charts lay discarded, some soaked with melted frost, ink blurred but legible enough to hint at operations. Every trace spoke of panic, haste, and an urgent desire to erase evidence before retreat. Frost glistened on metal, wood, and stone, amplifying the camp's eerie stillness. The scouts proceeded slowly, cataloguing detail while resisting the impulse to move too quickly. Snow muffled sound, yet every step was amplified in the mind, echoing in heightened anticipation. In these abandoned corridors, suspense was a tangible presence, pressing against skin, breathing, and perception. Hidden behind trees, the scouts observed distant chimneys emitting faint, weak smoke, a remnant of improvised fires for the few left behind. The wind carried whispers of coughs, groans, and the faint stirrings of life in shadowed corners. Children clutched each other, shivering, their small figures pale against snow-covered ground. Frost-rimmed uniforms, binoculars, and helmets sparkling like fractured crystal in muted sunlight. Each observation required care, each step measured against possible traps or sudden confrontation. The air was dense with anticipation, weighted by history, absence, and human suffering. The camp's skeletal outlines loomed through fog, a landscape of silence punctuated by traces of panic and haste. Broken doors, scattered papers, and abandoned belongings created a mosaic of human desperation. Every sound, scent, and movement carried meaning, amplifying suspense, demanding focus. Step by careful step, the soldiers advanced toward the unimaginable truth at the heart of Auschwitz. By late morning, the perimeter was breached, the first scouts crossing under barbed wire gaps, entering spaces long abandoned but weighted with human presence. Empty courtyards stretched like frozen oceans, footprints etched across snow, fleeting evidence of life and flight. Buildings stood silent, yet vibrated with memory. Every wall, every board holding a faint echo of screams, whispers, and orders. Frost clung to every surface, glinting sharply, highlighting textures, shadows, and small remnants of human occupation. Small fires smoldered, smoke curling lazily toward pale sky, a weak heartbeat in a frozen, haunted landscape. Children peeked from corners, faces pale and wide, bodies trembling, observing the soldiers with cautious curiosity. Broken furniture, scattered tools, and empty bunks told stories the wind carried in whispered form. Even the slightest noise, a falling icicle, shifting snow, the creak of wood, echoed across the compound, amplifying suspense. Every step forward pressed the scouts deeper into understanding, yet comprehension lagged behind observation. Through a veil of frost and wire, the soldiers glimpsed something that words could not prepare them for. The first light of January 27th, 1945, filtered weakly through the frost-laden sky, casting pale illumination over the vast perimeter of Auschwitz. Tanks idled silently, their metal hulls cold and gleaming, engines vibrating subtly against frozen earth. Soviet soldiers crouched behind snow-dusted embankments, rifles poised, breath visible in thin clouds that mingled with faint exhaust. Barbed wire stretched in irregular lines, glinting under frost, awaiting the deliberate hands that would soon sever its hold. The wind carried scents of ice, smoke, and faint traces of human occupation, heavy with both absence and lingering life. Prisoners emerged from shadows, shielding eyes against the winter glare, faces gaunt, hair matted, expressions frozen between fear and disbelief. Wooden guard towers leaned precariously against the pale sky, windows empty, doors swinging on warped hinges in rhythm with the breeze. The silence was immense, punctuated only by the soft hum of engines and the distant, brittle creak of frost-laden gates. Each soldier advanced carefully, rifles ready, scanning every corner for potential resistance or lingering danger. In this moment, anticipation and awe intermingled, heavy and tangible, pressing against skin and breath alike. Wire cutters bit through twisted metal with precise grinding resistance, sending sparks of ice and rust into the cold air. The first sections of fencing fell silently, like brittle bones breaking beneath unseen pressure. Soldiers moved methodically, glancing toward the inner camp where shadows shifted among long-abandoned buildings. Frost-rimmed rifles, helmets, and the edges of winter coats, sparkling in muted sunlight, a delicate contrast to the brutal task at hand. Inside the camp, prisoners hesitated, unsure if this intrusion signaled rescue or renewed terror. Children clutched each other, wide-eyed, trembling, while adults crouched, muscles coiled, ready for sudden command or chaos. The ground bore the frozen impressions of hurried evacuations, footprints leading nowhere, stories left half-told in snow and ice. The scent of smoke from burned papers mingled with the metallic tang of rusted implements, lingering in the thin air. Each cut of wire was a step closer to freedom, yet the weight of history pressed upon every motion. Anticipation grew, a pulse of awe rippling quietly through both liberators and liberated. The gates yielded under measured force, hinges groaning, metal protesting against decades of winter and neglect. Snow scattered with each movement, dusting the boots of soldiers as they pressed forward into the courtyard. Prisoners stood frozen, fragile forms outlined against frost and abandoned barracks, unsure whether to move or remain hidden. The sound of engines, soft clanking of metal, and distant echoes of collapsing structures created a symphony of cautious entry. Frost crunched beneath advancing boots, a rhythmic percussion blending with the whisper of the wind through skeletal trees. Children blinked against pale sunlight, faces etched with disbelief and uncertainty. Some survivors moved tentatively toward soldiers, bodies trembling, eyes wide, muscles stiff from cold and fear. The scent of human sweat, earth, and lingering smoke filled the air, a potent reminder of suffering endured. Guards had fled, leaving emptiness, filled only with the ghosts of violence and abandonment. Step by careful step, the camp's silence transformed, shifting from oppressive dread to tentative wonder. Inside the barracks, soldiers paused to absorb scale and devastation, eyes tracing long rows of bunks, each a testament to cruelty and endurance. Frosted windows, fragmented sunlight across emaciated bodies, broken furniture, and scattered belongings. The faint smell of decay mingled with smoke and frost hung heavy in the air, pressing against lungs and consciousness. Children peeked from corners, fragile yet alert, while older prisoners stepped forward cautiously, testing the intentions of their liberators. Every object, from scorched bedding to abandoned utensils, narrated stories of survival, cruelty, and hurried abandonment. Outside, snow glistened under muted sun, blanketing footprints, discarded shoes, and makeshift pathways. The wind carried whispers, moans, and tentative words, sounds amplified by emptiness and anticipation. Frost crunched under careful movement, emphasizing the weight of every step across frozen earth. Soldiers moved in measured patterns, scanning corridors, documenting and absorbing the breadth of horror and endurance. Awe pressed down with every breath, a recognition of human suffering and the fragile persistence of life. In the open courtyards, tanks cast long shadows across snow, their presence a reminder of approaching authority and protection. Soldiers advanced in disciplined formations, rifles held lightly, scanning for the faintest sign of lingering threat. Frost clung to uniforms, helmets, and gloves, scattering sunlight into tiny crystalline prisms over cold faces. Prisoners shifted hesitantly, some stepping toward warmth and human contact, others frozen in disbelief. The camp's structures loomed in skeletal grandeur, empty watchtowers stretching toward pale sky, chimneys standing as mute witnesses. The scent of smoke, metallic tang, and earth filled the air, heavy with history, absence, and survival. Children's eyes followed each movement, wide and unblinking, occasionally reflecting glimmers of hope. Step by step, soldiers extended the perimeter of safety, cutting barriers and guiding the fragile forward. The interplay of silence and movement heightened awe, each pause pregnant with potential discovery. Every interaction, however small, marked the fragile bridge between horror endured and liberation at hand. From distant barracks, faint smoke trailed upward, remnants of fires hastily constructed for warmth or survival. Soldiers paused, noting the improvisation, the persistence of human life amidst desolation. Frosted rooftops glistened, small movements of birds or animals breaking the monotony of empty space. Footsteps crunched softly across courtyards, echoing in the crisp, cold air, amplifying tension and awe. Children clutched tattered clothing, some lifted by cautious arms of liberators, faces uncertain, bodies trembling. The metallic tang of rust and ice mixed with smoke and faint sweat, sensory testimony to both abandonment and endurance. Broken doors, scattered papers, and damaged furniture provided glimpses into the meticulous cruelty of those who had fled. Soldiers documented, observed, and guided, each step measured, every interaction laden with both caution and compassion. Frost glistened along edges of structures, casting reflections over pale, gaunt faces. In this space of silence and exposure, awe became a tangible force, pressing against senses and memory alike. The inner camp revealed long corridors of bunkers, emptied but still heavy with memory. Frost-glazed walls and ceilings, sparkling in muted light, emphasizing the scale and desolation. Soldiers moved slowly, rifles slung low, documenting, cataloging, absorbing each stark detail. The faint creak of shifting wood echoed in the quiet, punctuating the heavy stillness with reminders of fragility. Children clutched adults, their voices small and hesitant, blending with distant whispers of the recovered weak. Snow outside glimmered across footprints, discarded boots, and scattered belongings, a frozen map of human endurance. Every corner held the imprint of hasty evacuation, panic, and desperation, revealing both cruelty and perseverance. The scent of smoke, frost, and human toil lingered, tangible and oppressive. Movement was careful, deliberate, each step weighted with the gravity of witnessing history. Awe resonated in every observation, a profound recognition of the scale of suffering and the fragile triumph of survival. By late afternoon, the gates fully yielded, the Red Army fully within the camp, the frozen landscape, now a stage of liberation and disbelief. Prisoners moved slowly forward, uncertain, bodies weak, eyes wide with confusion, hope, and cautious trust. Tanks cast long, dark shadows across snow-laden courtyards, while soldiers extended hands, offered blankets, and guided the frail. Frost clung to hair, coats, and metal alike, glittering in pale sunlight, a fragile counterpoint to exhaustion and despair. Children clung to each other, then to the liberators, faces frozen with disbelief. bodies trembling with the unfamiliar weight of safety. Smoke from small fires twisted lazily upward, a faint reminder of human persistence amidst desolation. The metallic tang of abandoned implements, ice and sweat mixed, pressing against senses and memory. Every movement, every touch, every word carried weight, bridging horror and newfound freedom. Silence softened, replaced by tentative sound, coughs, whispered words, faint laughter, the stirrings of life renewed. Liberation came not with triumphal fanfare, but with footsteps heavy from disbelief. The first survivors stepped cautiously into the sunlight, bodies thin, limbs trembling, eyes wide with disbelief at the figures emerging through the frost. Soviet soldiers knelt to meet them at eye level, hands extended with blankets, water, and small rations of food, gestures heavy with both authority and care. The wind carried a mixture of smoke, frost, and the faint metallic tang of abandoned implements pressing against lungs already strained by hunger and illness. Children hesitated, clinging to emaciated parents, faces frozen with uncertainty and cautious curiosity. Frost glistened on eyelashes, hair, and the edges of coats, catching muted sunlight and scattering it across gaunt features. Every hand extended was measured, tentative, each touch carrying both reassurance and the weight of human fragility. Some prisoners fell to their knees, unable to comprehend the sudden presence of help, while others reached forward, trembling yet desperate. The crunch of boots on snow punctuated the silence, rhythmically underscoring the gravity of the first contact. Tears, both frozen and warm, streaked pale cheeks, reflecting sunlight in fractured prisms. In this delicate collision of hope and trauma, awe mingled with relief, palpable and nearly unbearable. Medics moved swiftly, distributing soup, bread, and sugar water, their hands steady despite the overwhelming scene before them. The smell of hot broth penetrated the icy air, mingling with frost, sweat, and the lingering metallic scent of abandoned camp machinery. Prisoners cupped hands around bowls, trembling, sipping cautiously, tasting warmth and nourishment for the first time in months. Children huddled close, sharing spoons, eyes wide at the simple miracle of sustenance. Soldiers guided the frail toward makeshift shelters, blankets draped carefully over shoulders, fragile bodies supported with deliberate care. Frosted breath rose in thin clouds, curling around faces and mingling with smoke from distant fires, a quiet testament to survival. Small gestures, tucking hair behind ears, adjusting a blanket, offering water, became acts of profound tenderness. Every footstep, every movement, carried dual weight, the physical effort and the emotional shock of transition. Shadows from barracks and chimneys stretched across the snow, framing the scene with frozen geometry, light and darkness intermingling. Through these small acts, trust began to emerge tentatively, fragile yet undeniable. Faces were etched with disbelief, lines deepened by exhaustion, malnutrition, and long years of fear, yet now softened by the presence of strangers bearing aid. Eyes that had once avoided contact lifted, tracking the careful movements of soldiers and medics. Small smiles flickered, hesitant and fragile, trembling in the cold air as warmth slowly reached frozen cheeks. The sound of shivering, whispered words and tentative laughter punctuated the stillness, a delicate music rising from grief. Frosted lashes caught the weak sunlight, sparkling over hollow eyes, a fragile mirror to the endurance these bodies had embodied. Children tentatively reached for hands extended in reassurance, tiny fingers gripping gloves or mittens in disbelief. The scent of soup, bread, and human presence mingled with ice and metal, grounding the moment in both the physical and emotional. Soldiers and prisoners alike moved slowly, acutely aware of each fragile step, each interaction weighted with significance. Every gaze exchanged was a negotiation between past terror and present possibility, fleeting yet profound. In these moments, shock blended with tenderness, a delicate equilibrium that could not yet fully be articulated. Outside the barracks, snow-covered courtyards were alive with movement, subtle yet charged with emotion, as small groups gathered around medics. Hands were held, blankets adjusted, rations shared, and small acts of care performed against the backdrop of abandoned camp structures. Frost glimmered on the edges of clothing, rifles and helmets, scattering muted light across the pale faces of the recently freed. Children leaned against shoulders, silent and still, absorbing warmth from those who had become sudden protectors. The metallic tang of snowmelt and abandoned machinery mixed with human sweat, forming a sensory memory of endurance and liberation. Soldiers scanned the perimeter carefully, rifles low but ready, eyes alert to both remnants of danger and glimpses of human fragility. Every movement was deliberate, measured against the possibility of collapse or misstep, fragile bodies requiring protection. The echo of boots against frost-covered ground served as a rhythm, marking both time and human resilience. Some prisoners wept openly, bodies trembling, voices choked, yet the soldiers' calm presence lent stability. In this courtyard, shock and tenderness coalesced, producing a fragile, poignant awe. A small group of emaciated women huddled together near a wooden barrack, clutching children whose eyes reflected the pale sunlight and deep uncertainty. Medics approached carefully, offering soup and gentle words, their hands brushing hair and shoulders with tender precision. Frost rimmed every object in the courtyard, wooden planks, barbed wire, and discarded boots, catching light in fractured reflections that mirrored the survivors' trembling faces. Children's hands reached instinctively, pulling blankets closer, clinging to warmth and the tangible proof of care. Soldiers and medics paused periodically, scanning for signs of remaining danger, yet fully absorbed in the human narrative unfolding. Small murmurs, whispered names, and tentative reassurances echoed through the icy air, fragile sounds in a silent world. Frost clung to hair, eyelashes, and collars, highlighting gaunt faces with crystal clarity. The faint clatter of distant gates or shifting snow punctuated the scene, adding rhythm to the delicate interactions. Every act of care, every offered morsel of food carried monumental weight, both practical and emotional. Awe lingered, heavy and tangible, surrounding these first fragile encounters with liberation. Inside larger barracks, survivors cautiously explored spaces once ruled by terror, moving with tentative steps, eyes tracking the unfamiliar presence of soldiers. The metallic tang of abandoned implements, mixed with the smell of sweat, frost, and smoke, pressed against senses already overstimulated. Children reached for small comforts, a blanket, a hand, a morsel of food, while adults hesitated, gauging the intentions of those entering their world. The faint creak of floorboards, the shift of frost-covered furniture, and distant laughter or coughs became punctuation marks in a narrative of fragile renewal. Soldiers observed quietly, offering small gestures, guiding movement without overwhelming, establishing a rhythm of trust. Frost glittered on window edges, broken doors, and scattered personal effects, reflecting both desolation and endurance. Every whispered word, every touch, every extended hand became a bridge between fear and the tentative embrace of hope. Shadows moved across walls and floors, highlighting skeletal structures and the ghosts of past terror. The scale of human suffering was immediate, yet tempered by the presence of care and cautious compassion. Shock mingled with tenderness in every motion, every gesture, every breath. In the open snow, survivors tentatively moved towards small fires lit by medics, bodies hunched against wind and cold. Children's eyes reflected flames, warmth, and fleeting security, faces pale yet animated by fragile curiosity. Soldiers assisted, guiding steps, offering blankets, and supporting the weakest, their presence a delicate anchor in a chaotic world. Frost glistened across hair, collars, and gloves, catching the light and emphasizing every tremble, every hesitation. The metallic tang of frost and abandoned implements mixed with the comforting aroma of soup and rations, sensory proof of life restored. Emaciated limbs flexed cautiously, muscles weak but willing to respond to care and nourishment. Small gestures, a tuck of a blanket, a sip of soup, a guiding hand, resonated profoundly in the frozen landscape. Snow crunched beneath careful boots, marking the rhythm of cautious exploration and human reconnection. Each interaction between soldier and survivor carried emotional gravity, fragile yet monumental. Awe and tender disbelief pervaded, a mixture of shock, relief, and cautious wonder. By late afternoon, the compound thrummed with quiet motion, liberated bodies tentatively reclaiming space once filled with terror. Frost clung to every surface, refracting muted sunlight across faces etched with exhaustion and resilience. Soldiers and medics moved deliberately, every step and gesture weighted with purpose and care. Children clung to adults. Adults leaned on one another, forming fragile constellations of trust and warmth. The faint smell of food, smoke, and human exertion filled air, grounding the moment in both physical and emotional reality. Footsteps crunched across snow, echoing faintly against barracks and gates, marking the rhythm of liberation unfolding. Eyes met, soldier to prisoner, survivor to liberator, each gaze a bridge across years of fear and isolation. Frost sparkled on lashes, collars, and hair, glinting in fractured light, a delicate mirror to the fragile beauty of survival. Small murmurs, hesitant words, and gentle laughter punctuated the stillness, fragile yet profound. For the first time in years, the eyes of prisoners met strangers without fear, only wonder. The first piles of shoes emerged in the light of a weak winter sun, thousands of worn soles stacked haphazardly, silent yet screaming testimony to lives extinguished. Soldiers stepped cautiously around them, boots crunching on frost, eyes wide with disbelief, mouths dry from sudden unspoken horror. Each pair of shoes carried the weight of a story. A child's small boots polished by hope, women's delicate heels dulled by endurance, men's heavy boots scuffed by forced marches. Frost collected along edges and seams, emphasizing contours, catching sunlight in fractured glimmers that made the scene eerily luminous. The air was cold yet thick with the odor of leather, dust, and decay pressing against lungs with oppressive insistence. Soldiers paused, rifling through the stacks with quiet reverence, touching objects that carried lives now gone. Nearby, frost-crusted barracks loomed, shadows stretching long and dark across frozen ground, emphasizing absence. The wind whispered across the piles, lifting dust motes and echoes of movement long past. Every footstep, every exhalation felt intrusive in this space where silence was heavier than frost or snow. Awe transformed into horror, subtle yet overwhelming, pressing into every corner of the mind. In a nearby courtyard, heaps of eyeglasses lay scattered, lenses fogged and frames twisted, refracting light in fragmented patterns. Each pair reflected absent eyes, frozen in memory, traces of intellect, vision, and human vulnerability. Soldiers stooped, carefully examining them, their gloved hands hesitant, brushing away frost and dirt, revealing shapes warped by neglect and abandonment. The cold wind carried the faint scent of rust, iron, and human sweat, pressing against the shock settling over the men. The contrast between small, delicate frames and the enormity of the piles was a physical punctuation of cruelty. Footsteps crunched softly on frost, sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness of desolation. Some soldiers pressed hands over mouths, eyes darting to the nearest medic or comrade, seeking shared acknowledgement of the unthinkable. Shadows of barbed wire and towers stretched long, framing the piles like grim monuments. Snowflakes swirled slowly in the courtyard, catching in frames and freezing hair, accentuating the frozen permanence of human loss. Each lens told a story, and the horror seeped into the marrow of every observer. The approach to the gas chambers was tentative, boots scuffing against frozen earth, the metallic tang of lingering chemical traces faint but unmistakable. Doors hung ajar or lay collapsed, hinges rusted, frost crawling over every surface like delicate veins. Smoke and frost mingled, creating a surreal haze that blurred reality, shadows stretching across tiled floors scarred with soot and decay. Soldiers moved slowly inside, noting scorch marks, abandoned clothing, and traces of frantic human movement. The stench of damp, chemical residue and decay pressed heavily against senses, forcing awareness of cruelty beyond imagination. Small personal effects, scarves, combs, discarded jewelry, were strewn across floors, testament to fleeting individuality erased violently. Frosted windows filtered pale sunlight, scattering it into fractured rays across empty, silent chambers. The wind moaned through broken vents, carrying ghostly echoes that amplified the sense of absence and horror. Each step forward was a confrontation with evidence, unavoidable, relentless, suffocating. Soldiers pressed on, silent, absorbing the scale of atrocity, hearts heavy with a dread beyond the battlefield. Nearby, piles of human hair were stacked meticulously, bound in thick, rough bundles, the tactile reality of systematic dehumanization. The hair glimmered faintly in frost and light, an unsettling beauty, soft yet ominously precise, whispering the enormity of industrialized murder. Hands hovered over bundles, soldiers recoiling instinctively, fingertips tracing texture as if to confirm reality. Frost clung to each strand, sparkling unnaturally in the pale sunlight, creating a surreal, almost ethereal sheen over the grotesque evidence. Soldiers inhaled slowly, tasting the cold air, tinged faintly with dust and iron, every breath a reminder of what had been endured. Shadows from crumbling structures fell over the piles, emphasizing scale and the human cost compressed into material form. The silence was oppressive, punctuated only by soft, tentative movements of medics, documenting and cataloguing the scene. Each bundle represented hundreds, thousands lives erased, identities stripped down to hair. The wind lifted strands, tiny filaments dancing briefly before settling again, an eerie reminder of absence and endurance. Horror settled deeply, heavy, inescapable, coiling around every observer, demanding recognition of humanity's darkest capacity. In the remnants of what had been storage for personal belongings, soldiers discovered small, everyday objects scattered and half buried in frost and dirt. Buttons, watches, and trinkets reflected dim light, mundane artifacts made grotesque by the scale of death surrounding them. Soldiers knelt, brushing snow from the surfaces, fingers trembling slightly, confronting intimacy stolen violently. The air was sharp with frost, cold and pure, yet saturated with human history, memory, and loss. Each object seemed to vibrate with the absent presence of its owner, echoing a life abruptly terminated. Frost collected along edges and seams, glinting, highlighting detail with cruel precision. Footsteps crunched softly around the periphery, amplifying the dissonance between movement and stillness, life and absence. The scale of systematic erasure became clear. These were not anomalies, but evidence of industrialized destruction. Soldiers' eyes met briefly, understanding passing without words, a silent acknowledgement of horror. Every object, every fragment, every trace demanded contemplation, an unspoken reckoning with reality. Outside, long rows of empty bunks and crumbling barracks provided a visual scale of the human toll, frost glinting on rough wood and twisted nails. Soldiers moved deliberately, documenting positions, measurements, and the remnants of abandoned lives. The metallic tang of rust, mixed with the faint scent of decay and snow, filled each inhalation, pressing awareness of atrocity into memory. Footprints led nowhere, ending abruptly in snow or mud, silent testaments to the speed of evacuation or the permanence of death. The sheer scale of evidence, the organized chaos of destruction overwhelmed the senses, pressing the weight of reality against consciousness. Windows reflected pale light across skeletal structures, shadows stretching long across the frozen courtyards. Soldiers paused frequently, scanning the empty spaces, absorbing detail, letting horror settle slowly, fully, deep into understanding. Small tremors of disbelief passed silently among them, mirrored in tense shoulders and furrowed brows. Frost glimmered faintly over every surface, accentuating absence, memory, and loss. In these empty barracks, the magnitude of human suffering became undeniable, and utterly incomprehensible. Piles of personal items extended across courtyards and storage areas, a haunting mosaic of human lives reduced to objects. Shoes, clothing, and suitcases lay in geometric disarray, frost glinting across surfaces, each item whispering its owner's story. Soldiers' footsteps stirred the snow, creating an audible contrast between movement and profound stillness. The air was thick with memory, the metallic tang of rust and frost mingling with faint traces of smoke and sweat. Children's clothing, tiny and delicate, lay near boots too large for their owners, amplifying emotional shock. Frost sparkled along edges of abandoned barracks, broken doors, and scattered implements, emphasizing the frozen permanence of human absence. Soldiers catalogued carefully, documenting, noting detail. Every movement weighed against the scale of discovery. Wind lifted dust, hair, and debris, scattering fragile reminders across the courtyards like spectral echoes. Every observation deepened horror, each step pressing the enormity of atrocity into consciousness. Silence descended heavier than any battlefield, an oppressive, inescapable testament to cruelty and endurance. By late afternoon, the Soviets understood the scale of what they had uncovered. The industrialized magnitude of human suffering laid bare before frost and sun. Emaciated survivors observed quietly, fragile bodies weighed down by trauma, eyes tracking soldiers who moved like careful witnesses through evidence. Snow crunched under boots, echoing faintly against barracks and broken fences, a rhythm marking the pace of comprehension. Piles of shoes, hair, and clothing stretched into distant shadows, endless and precise, each item a fragment of erased identity. Soldiers paused often, gloved hands brushing frost from objects, cataloguing meticulously, documenting the unthinkable with measured care. The metallic tang of abandoned implements mingled with the cold, clean scent of snow, reinforcing the surreal nature of reality. Footsteps were careful, deliberate, each step weighed by understanding, horror, and responsibility. Shadows stretched across courtyards and buildings, fractured light glinting over frozen evidence, making absence tangible. Every object, every trace of life destroyed, pressed a profound weight onto consciousness. No battlefield prepared them for this, a silence heavier than war itself. Frail voices trembled against the biting wind, carried across snow-covered courtyards where silence had long reigned, now broken by human memory. Survivors huddled beside smoldering ruins, faces pale and gaunt, eyes fixed on soldiers who moved gently among them. Frost clung to hair and clothing, catching pale sunlight in fractured glimmers that danced across tense, trembling faces. Each whispered recollection surfaced slowly, fragile as ice, yet charged with unbearable weight. Soldiers leaned closer, notebooks ready, eyes reflecting reverence and horror, careful not to interrupt the rhythm of memory. The scent of smoke, frost, and faint metallic tangs pressed against lungs, mingling with faint traces of human sweat. Children listened silently, clinging to trembling adults, absorbing fragments of horror beyond comprehension. Each testimony unfolded in measured fragments, hesitant yet resolute, a fragile testament to survival. Footsteps on frost-crusted ground punctuated the hushed recollections, echoes amplifying stories of cruelty, endurance, and desperation. In this fragile assembly, reverence pressed palpably, shaping the first bridge between atrocity and understanding. One survivor recounted the endless march of prisoners from block to block, voices muted yet vivid in description, a slow cadence of terror. Frost crept along the edges of abandoned barracks, catching light and highlighting the skeletal remains of structures that bore witness. Soldiers listened, noting trembling hands, faltering speech, and eyes wide with memory, capturing detail that no photograph could convey. The bitter scent of smoke mingled with frozen earth, emphasizing both absence and the presence of long-endured suffering. Children hugged blankets, small fingers pressed to lips, sensing the gravity of words too heavy for full comprehension. Nearby, discarded utensils and torn clothing reflected faint sunlight, tangible echoes of the stories unfolding. Every sentence carried the weight of history, a bridge spanning years of fear and resilience. Wind whispered through broken windows and barbed wire, lending a fragile music to the narration. Each hesitant recollection pressed into consciousness like frost seeping into skin, cold yet undeniable. Reverence filled the air, heavy as snow, yet light enough to cradle fragile hope. Another spoke of hidden corners where the sick and dying had been left behind, bodies trembling and gasping for warmth, often unseen by guards. Frosted rooftops reflected pale sunlight across hollow courtyards, illuminating emptiness and the paths of terror. Soldiers observed, careful to note every nuance, every pause, every tremor of voice or hand. The wind carried faint ashes from burned papers, mingling with the scent of earth, human sweat, and lingering smoke. Children shivered in blankets, faces pale, absorbing stories beyond their years, eyes wide with tentative understanding. Footsteps on snow punctuated the silent testimony, a rhythm marking both movement and gravity. Frost clung to eyelashes and collars, emphasizing the frozen permanence of these recollections. The survivor's voice wavered, yet strengthened with each detail, painting a picture of systematic cruelty. Every account pressed the weight of reality into those listening, undeniable and immediate. Reverence hung over the group like frost-laden branches, delicate yet unbreakable. Whispers described the gas chambers, small details emerging slowly, careful, weighted by trauma and fear. Frost settled on ruined doors and broken tiles, glinting in fractured sunlight that scattered across silent, empty chambers. Soldiers moved quietly, recording measurements, documenting evidence, while simultaneously witnessing the human cost behind the statistics. The bitter tang of metallic residue mixed with smoke and frost pressed against lungs, grounding memory in physical reality. Children clutched hands and blankets, listening to syllables heavy with pain, uncomprehending yet absorbing emotion. Shadows stretched across empty hallways, long and distorted, framing the thin figures as they recounted horror. Each pause, each faltering word reinforced the fragility of memory, yet the resilience of testimony. Footsteps were soft, careful, maintaining rhythm without intrusion. echoing through frost-crusted spaces. Soldiers' eyes darted between faces, absorbing nuance, gauging the sincerity and weight of each recollection. Reverence filled the frozen air, intangible yet unmistakable, pressing lightly on every observer. Another survivor spoke of the piles, shoes, hair, clothing, each item a story stripped to form, catalogued yet alive with silent testimony. Frost crunched under careful boots as soldiers approached, documenting each heap with solemn care. The wind lifted dust and fine fibers, scattering fragments of the past across courtyards and frozen earth. Soldiers listened intently, eyes tracing each pile, hands adjusting notebooks and cameras to capture scale and detail. Children peeked from behind adults, eyes wide, fingers gripping mittens or collars, absorbing horror without comprehension. Sunlight fractured across frozen surfaces, reflecting glimmers that mimicked movement in the still air. Each object became a portal, bridging absence and memory, tangible proof of human suffering. Frost clung to soldiers' gloves and pens, emphasizing stillness and the cold weight of observation. Testimonies traced invisible connections between objects and lives lost, narrative threads winding tightly across space and time. In every whispered word, reverence mingled with horror, a delicate acknowledgement of endurance and atrocity. Voices turned to the death marches, recounting steps in snow, exhaustion, and the quiet surrender of those too weak to continue. Frost glittered across footprints, abandoned paths frozen as if time itself had been arrested. Soldiers knelt, tracing paths with eyes and notes, listening as survivors painted images of collapse, cruelty, and fleeting compassion. The wind carried whispers of distant snow-laden forests, amplifying stories of bodies left behind, blankets lost, and voices stilled forever. Children hugged one another, silent, absorbing weight they could not articulate, faces pale in frost-reflected sunlight. Soldiers documented meticulously, careful to preserve every inflection, pause, and tremor in voice. Frost collected along the edges of barracks, wire, and scattered belongings, echoing the frozen permanence of these memories. Each account added gravity, detail, texture, and rhythm to the horror of the marches. Silence between stories became sacred, filled with reflection, acknowledgement, and trembling awe. Reverence pressed in every corner, like frost settling on frozen soil, delicate yet impossible to remove. The survivors spoke of quiet corners where hope had briefly survived, hidden caches of food, shared whispers of prayer, small kindnesses amidst despair. Frost-rimmed, ruined windows and abandoned furniture, glinting as the wind carried faint smoke and ash. Soldiers listened without interruption, hands steady, eyes reflecting the solemnity of each story. Children pressed closer to adults, faces pale, eyes wide, absorbing fragments of life and memory. Footsteps on snow punctuated pauses, creating rhythm that mirrored the cadence of recollection. Frost clung to collars, gloves, and hair, accentuating the fragility and resilience of human presence. Each detail, from whispered prayer to stolen morsel, reinforced the complexity of survival under systematic cruelty. Shadows stretched long across the courtyards, marking time and memory, framing words with visual resonance. The cold pressed against skin and breath, yet warmth lingered in human connection, however fleeting. Reverence hovered like smoke, fragile and rising, carrying stories that demanded remembrance. By late afternoon, the survivors' words coalesced into a fragile archive of experience, suspended between past suffering and present witness. Frost glimmered across ruins and courtyards, reflecting pale sunlight onto gaunt faces etched with endurance. Soldiers catalogued carefully, notes, sketches, and cameras capturing nuance beyond numbers, capturing life itself in fragile form. Children shivered in blankets, absorbing fragments of horror and resilience, silent witnesses to a history they would carry forever. Footsteps on snow crunched softly, rhythmically, echoing across barracks and empty courtyards. Dust and ash lifted in faint spirals, carrying whispers of past existence mingling with frost and wind. Voices trembled yet persisted, each syllable a monument, each pause a testament to survival and witness. Shadows stretched long across frozen ground, bridging ruins and living memory, light and absence intertwined. The wind carried stories soft, deliberate, tremulous, pressing into consciousness, impossible to ignore. Their words rose like smoke, thin, fragile, yet impossible to extinguish. Small figures moved cautiously through the snow-dusted courtyards, eyes wide, hands clutching striped clothing once forced upon them as uniforms of suffering. Frost glimmered along hair and collars, catching pale sunlight in fractured patterns, highlighting gaunt faces that seemed too small to hold such horror. Soviet nurses knelt gently beside trembling bodies, hands warm against icy skin, fingers brushing hair back from pale, hollowed cheeks. The smell of frost, smoke, and faint remnants of human presence pressed into lungs, tangible proof of endurance and deprivation. Children's fingers clutched tightly at fabric, soot-streaked and frozen, connecting to a past that was both familiar and impossibly distant. Every cautious step pressed into frozen earth, boots crunching softly, yet the silence carried weight beyond sound. Some drew tentative sketches on barracks walls, fragile markings that captured fleeting memories of life and play now almost erased. Shadows stretched across courtyards and broken windows, framing innocence within ruins, highlighting the vulnerability of small bodies against vast destruction. Eyes flicked towards soldiers and medics with suspicion and hope, alternating in fragile rhythm. In their tentative movements, innocence and endurance intertwined, fragile yet unbroken. In the corner of a shattered barrack, children huddled together, whispered names escaping lips that had almost forgotten speech. Frost collected along broken window panes, shimmering faintly as sunlight fractured through glass, illuminating tiny faces frozen by trauma. Nurses offered blankets and warm broth, small gestures met with hesitant trust, hands brushing trembling shoulders. Each sip of liquid warmth carried significance, grounding bodies long starved and minds long suspended in fear. Tiny hands clutched corners of blankets, gripping fabric as if it could tether them to the world beyond terror. Footsteps on snow punctuated whispered conversation, a rhythm both grounding and fragile. Children explored small spaces slowly, fingers tracing walls where drawings told stories too heavy for speech. Frost glistened on pencil scratches and smudges, creating a delicate interplay between survival and memory. Every glance towards soldiers or medics measured the distance between fear and trust. Innocence, wounded yet persistent, whispered quietly beneath the weight of unimaginable experience. Some children followed soldiers cautiously, small feet slipping on icy ground, yet driven by curiosity and instinct for survival. Striped fabric clutched tightly to chests carried the scent of frost and human toil, a tangible link to vanished parents and lost kin. Frost clung to eyelashes and collars, refracting muted light across faces, highlighting features too young for trauma yet irrevocably altered. Tiny voices murmured questions, often unanswered, yet resonating in the silent courtyard with fragile insistence. Medics moved deliberately, crouching to eye level, hands steady and warm, offering water, blankets, and reassurance. Shadows from broken barracks and chimneys stretched across snow, framing small figures like fragile monuments in frozen space. Every step taken was measured, a negotiation between curiosity and caution, innocence and learned fear. Children's eyes tracked movements, absorbing gestures of care, weighing trust in moments both fleeting and profound. Frost collected along hair and clothing, emphasizing the delicate physicality of fragile bodies navigating immense loss. In each movement, each glance, innocence remained wounded yet remarkably persistent. In a narrow corridor, a child crouched beside smoldering ruins, tiny fingers tracing charred wood where scribbles had been etched in desperation. Frosted windows caught sunlight, scattering it across walls, illuminating the delicate act of memory-making. Soldiers paused, observing quietly, hands resting on notebooks, eyes capturing subtle gestures, breaths held in respect. The air carried the bitter tang of smoke and ash, pressed against senses already overwhelmed by the weight of evidence. Tiny whispers filled the corridor, naming lost siblings, places and fleeting joys, fragile lifelines against the void. Frost clung to hair and collars, highlighting every tremor and hesitation, every moment of cautious hope. The child's small figure shivered, not entirely from cold, but from the emotional gravity of recalling horror. Footsteps outside echoed softly, punctuating the quiet rhythm of observation and preservation. Every mark, every whisper carried disproportionate weight, testament to survival amidst systematic annihilation. Reverence hung thick, surrounding small hands and fragile memories with solemn, unspoken acknowledgement. Outside, children cautiously approached piles of abandoned clothing, eyes wide, fingers brushing frozen fabric in tentative exploration. Frost sparkled on collars, buttons, and edges of coats, reflecting sunlight like tiny mirrors over gaunt faces. Soldiers moved alongside, guiding steps without intrusion, balancing oversight with delicate respect for fragile agency. The wind lifted dust and fine fibers mingling with the faint metallic tang of abandoned objects, pressing history against senses. Each child hesitated over garments, sensing the absence of those who once wore them, a visceral confrontation with loss. Footsteps on snow punctuated silence, echoing softly, a rhythm aligning with tentative trust and exploration. Small voices whispered among themselves, fragmented phrases of curiosity, fear, and memory, fragile as frost. Shadows from chimneys and broken barracks stretched across the scene, creating a chiaroscuro of innocence against ruins. Every motion, glance, and pause carried emotional gravity, teaching both soldiers and children the enormity of survival. Innocence, delicate yet resilient, lingered persistently in the frozen light. In a quiet courtyard, Soviet medics knelt with children, hands warm against fragile limbs, offering broth and blankets in careful, measured movements. Frost-rimmed eyelashes and collars catching pale light, framing gaunt faces with unnatural precision. Tiny fingers reached out hesitating, testing warmth and human contact against the backdrop of abandonment. The bitter tang of frost, smoke, and distant metal pressed subtly against senses, grounding the moment in tangible reality. Footsteps crunched softly on snow, a measured rhythm underlining fragile interactions. Children observed, absorbed, and cautiously mirrored gestures, tentative trust mingling with lingering instinctive fear. Shadows stretched across snow-laden ground, broken walls and frozen implements framing human fragility against the vastness of loss. Each sip of broth, each offered blanket became a monumental act of survival, intimate and profound. Frost glimmered over small movements, amplifying both delicacy and endurance. Innocence, wounded and tempered by trauma, persisted quietly in every gesture. Some children discovered remnants of toys and drawings, etched into walls or half buried in frost-covered debris, fragile echoes of imagination surviving in ruins. Tiny fingers traced images, eyes reflecting pale sunlight. Awe mingled with tentative sorrow, absorbing fragments of absent childhood. Soldiers and medics observed silently, documenting and witnessing without intrusion, honoring the significance of small acts in vast tragedy. Frost clung to hair, collars and fingertips, highlighting delicate movements against cold, silent backdrops. The metallic tang of distant structures and ash mingled with the scent of frozen earth, pressing sensory weight into every observation. Footsteps on snow echoed intermittently, a rhythm marking observation and quiet reverence. Children shared whispered interpretations, soft voices carrying across courtyards, fragile yet insistent. Every drawing, every tactile exploration carried disproportionate meaning, connecting innocence and memory in delicate strands. Shadows stretched across broken walls, framing small bodies navigating spaces scarred by systematic cruelty. Wounded innocence persisted, whispering quietly through frozen courtyards and fragile gestures. By late afternoon, the children huddled together, warmth shared in blankets and human presence, eyes wide with fragile comprehension. Frost sparkled across collars, hair, and tiny mittens, catching fractured sunlight over frozen courtyards and ruins. Soldiers knelt and moved deliberately, hands steady, respecting the delicate equilibrium of trust, memory, and fragility. The wind whispered through broken windows and collapsed structures, lifting dust, ash, and frost into thin spirals of light and shadow. Footsteps crunched softly, marking rhythm without intrusion, echoing the careful cadence of observation and preservation. Tiny voices rose intermittently, whispers of memory, curiosity, and cautious hope, fragile yet persistent. Frost-rimmed walls, broken implements, and scattered fabric, framing small bodies against vast absence. Each gesture offering food, tucking a blanket, touching hair, became monumental, intimate, and profoundly human. The bitter beauty of endurance shimmered in every small interaction, fragile yet undeniable. Small voices whispered where millions had vanished, carrying history's heaviest secret. Soviet cameramen moved cautiously through frozen courtyards, hand-cranked cameras shaking slightly in their gloved hands as they captured images too vast to fully comprehend. Frost glittered along barbed wire and broken buildings, refracting pale sunlight across skeletal ruins. Each frame pressed into the lens the scale of atrocity, capturing shoes, hair, and skeletal bodies with unflinching precision. The air carried the faint tang of iron, smoke, and damp earth, pressing weight upon lungs already heavy with horror. Soldiers and medics paused often, watching silently as the camera whirred, documenting evidence that words alone could never fully convey. Children peeked from corners, curiosity mingled with fear, watching their frozen world rendered permanent in moving images. Footsteps crunched softly in the snow, echoing in rhythm with whirring reels and muted breath. Frost clung to edges of cameras, collars, and lenses, creating a delicate contrast between fragile human presence and enduring machinery. Every frame, every click of the shutter, bore witness to a systematic erasure of life. In capturing these images, documentation became both shield and testament, a tangible record of incomprehensible human loss. Reels were stacked in wooden crates, their surfaces dusted with frost, each spool a fragile vault of memory and evidence. Soldiers handled them carefully, fingers brushing edges, eyes wide, mouths dry from disbelief and exhaustion. Frost sparkled across crate corners and surrounding rubble, highlighting the tangible reality of preservation amid ruins. Cameras clicked and whirred, turning ephemeral horror into durable proof, light and shadow frozen in precise, deliberate motion. The bitter scent of smoke and ash mingled with metallic undertones, pressing awareness into every observer. Soldiers paused to adjust lenses, reframing skeletal structures, abandoned clothing, and scorched walls with painstaking care. Tiny tremors of disbelief passed silently among the crews, mirrored in hesitant movements and steadying breaths. Children's whispers floated in the cold air, echoes of fragile existence captured alongside the stark evidence. Frost collected on gloves, collars, and camera bodies, amplifying the cold, clinical precision of documentation. The act of filming, deliberate and methodical, became a sacred endeavor to ensure history could not be denied. Cameramen approached the gas chambers, lenses focused on doors ajar, frost glinting along hinges and rusted metal. Each frame pressed the weight of systematic murder into permanence, detailing scorch marks, cracked tiles, and abandoned clothing strewn across cold floors. Soldiers and medics lingered nearby, absorbing the enormity, faces pale, hands tense, breaths shallow and deliberate. The faint tang of chemicals lingered in the air, subtle yet inescapable, grounding every shot in tangible evidence. Footsteps crunched across frozen courtyards, punctuating the quiet whir of reels and the muted hum of human observation. Shadows stretched long across walls and floors, framing skeletal remnants and broken structures in stark chiaroscuro. Every shutter click recorded what soldiers feared might otherwise fade, preserving absence as tangible presence. Frost-rimmed broken windows, glinting against steel and wood, adding texture and scale to each image. Tiny echoes of children's voices and distant wind intertwined with the mechanical rhythm of documentation. The lens became an extension of conscience, translating grief and horror into enduring proof. Outside, soldiers posed cautiously beside piles of shoes and clothing, the camera capturing scale from frozen angles. Frost clung to edges of boots, sleeves, and collars, emphasizing the harsh reality under pale sunlight. Every frame pressed both soldiers and viewers into the weight of responsibility, capturing gestures of disbelief, care, and acknowledgement. Hand-cranked reels hummed, grinding slowly but purposefully, recording abandoned barracks, skeletal remains, and scattered personal items. The bitter tang of iron, frost, and ash permeated air, intertwining with the quiet clatter of equipment. Soldiers' breaths formed small clouds visible against grey skies and ruinous backdrops, transient yet framed permanently on film. Children lingered silent, eyes wide, their presence documented alongside evidence, a testament to both vulnerability and endurance. Footsteps echoed faintly across frozen earth, a subtle rhythm beneath the relentless whirring of reels. Each photograph and reel captured immensity, scale, and intimacy, translating human experience into recordable proof. Documentation became ritualized, deliberate, a solemn act that preserved memory and imposed witness. Cameramen shifted attention to skeletal remains huddled in corners, arranging angles to capture human fragility and frozen permanence. Frost-rimmed bones, clothing remnants, and scattered personal items, catching fragmented light in harsh, ethereal highlights. Soldiers stood back, silent, absorbing horror while observing the delicate interplay between light, subject, and frame. The wind whispered through broken barracks, lifting dust, ash, and frost in thin spirals that danced over skeletal forms. Footsteps crunched carefully, echoing against walls scarred with evidence, punctuating moments of observation and calculation. Each frame became a record of life stripped to its most elemental forms, every angle a testament to systematic cruelty. Children peeked from corners, tiny eyes reflecting glimmers of frost and film, connecting their fragile existence with captured memory. The bitter scent of iron and smoke pressed against senses, grounding every image in reality beyond the lens. Shadows stretched across frozen ground and ruined walls, providing scale and perspective, emphasizing absence and endurance. The act of documentation became both burden and witness, heavy with moral imperative. In nearby courtyards, reels captured abandoned hair and personal belongings in precise, deliberate sequences, framing the industrial scale of human suffering. Frost glimmered on edges of piles, creating fractured reflections across skeletal debris and scattered fabric. Soldiers adjusted cameras, hands steady despite the tremor of disbelief pressing in their chests. The bitter tang of smoke and metallic residue mingled with freezing air, pressing history onto every sense. Footsteps echoed softly on snow, rhythmically underscoring deliberate movements and careful documentation. Children observed from safe distances, fragile and silent, their presence adding haunting immediacy to each shot. Light fractured across ruins, frozen implements and skeletal remains, providing natural chiaroscuro that emphasized scale and absence. Every click, every crank of the reel translated horror into proof, tangible and indisputable. Shadows stretched long, mingling with frost and debris, providing visual resonance to human loss. Documentation became a moral imperative, ensuring that memory and evidence survived beyond the frozen moment. Soldiers moved cameras over barracks, smoldering ruins and frozen courtyards, capturing fragments of a civilization systematically erased. Frost clung to edges of camera lenses, collars and gloves, glinting with pale sunlight like tiny witness marks. Footsteps punctuated silence, soft and careful, mirroring the rhythm of whirring reels and deliberate framing. The bitter tang of ash and iron carried over frozen ground, pressing every sense into acknowledgement of scale and horror. Children lingered silently nearby, eyes wide, frozen in observation, yet contributing unintentional testimony to the unfolding record. Shadows cast by broken windows, chimneys, and wire-framed skeletal remnants, amplifying contrast and drawing the eye toward absence. Each frame became an archive, a fragile record against the tide of denial and historical erasure. Frost glimmered along broken structures, emphasizing permanence and fragility in equal measure. Soldiers' breath fogged lenses momentarily, visible in fleeting clouds that dispersed across ruined courtyards. The lens could not alter reality, but it began to preserve it, translating human suffering into indelible witness. By late afternoon, reels were carefully catalogued, crates stacked with meticulous precision, fragile evidence prepared for the journey beyond frozen gates. Frost-rimmed wood, metal and film, glinting in fractured light that highlighted the delicate tension of preservation. Soldiers moved deliberately, documenting scale, framing fragments of human life, and observing reactions of survivors nearby. Footsteps crunched softly across courtyards, echoing rhythmically against frozen walls and skeletal remnants. The bitter tang of iron, frost and ash pressed against lungs, mingling with the persistent weight of history. Shadows stretched across ruinous ground, emphasizing scale, absence, and the moral imperative of witness. Cameras whirred and clicked, recording texture, depth, and human presence alongside unimaginable absence. Children's pale faces, small hands, and whispered curiosity became incidental yet profound parts of documentation. Every frame, every reel, captured scale, nuance, and fragility, translating trauma into recordable truth. The lens could not heal the wounds, but it preserved them, so no one could deny. Red Army medics moved swiftly through makeshift hospitals, their breath steaming in the icy air as frost clung to canvas walls and metal equipment. Survivors, gaunt and trembling, lay on narrow cots, blankets insufficient against the winter chill, eyes hollow yet clinging to fragile awareness. The faint metallic tang of blood mixed with the bitter scent of smoke and frozen earth, pressing into every sense as doctors assessed pulse, breath, and temperature. Children clutched one another, tiny hands pale, faces streaked with frost and tears, while nurses spooned broth carefully, drop by drop, Footsteps crunched softly across frozen courtyards, echoing through tents and broken structures as soldiers and medics moved between beds. Improvised stoves sputtered, smoke curling through frayed canvas, providing warmth that barely touched the chill in bones. The whir of distant vehicles and muffled commands outside underscored the fragile urgency within these fragile spaces. Each heartbeat, each shallow breath became both fragile and miraculous, a testament to human endurance. Frost collected on collars, hair, and blankets, emphasizing the tenuous warmth that still remained. Amidst devastation, hope persisted quietly, measured in breaths and spoonfuls of broth, fragile but undeniable. Doctors worked with limited supplies, improvising bandages from torn cloth, mixing medications with meticulous care under flickering light. Frost rimmed every surface, tents, trays, and instruments, reflecting pale, fractured sunlight that filtered through canvas openings. Soldiers moved cautiously, offering support, arranging blankets, and observing each fragile procedure with solemn attention. The bitter tang of antiseptic mingled with smoke and frost, pressing the immediacy of life against senses numb from prolonged horror. Children stared silently, absorbing gestures of care, tentative trust flickering in small eyes. Every improvised stitch, every carefully rationed dose, carried monumental weight in fragile hands. Footsteps echoed softly across frozen ground, a rhythm mirroring slow progress against near-constant death. Small, quiet murmurs of survivors mingled with shallow breaths and the occasional cough, creating a subtle symphony of endurance. Frost glimmered on gloves, hair, and instruments, emphasizing delicate human presence amidst ruin. Hope remained fragile, like warmth struggling against winter, yet persistent in each measured act of care. Some survivors were too weak to move, bodies curled on narrow cots, skin pale, eyes dim, yet flickering with fragile awareness. Frost glimmered across blankets and makeshift bedding, catching fractured light as medics leaned close to observe pulse and breathing. The faint metallic scent of illness, mixed with frost and smoke, pressed heavily into senses, grounding the urgency of each intervention. Soldiers moved cautiously, offering support, adjusting blankets, and monitoring fragile signs of life with solemn focus. Children whispered, small voices trembling as nurses spooned warm broth, encouraging fragile swallows against shivering bodies. Every step, every touch, carried immense responsibility, the line between life and death rendered intimate and immediate. Footsteps crunched softly on frozen ground outside, punctuating quiet moments inside with the rhythm of survival. Frost collected along collars, gloves, and hair, emphasizing the tenuous warmth and delicate human presence. Improvised medical implements clattered softly, punctuating the hushed hum of life preserved against overwhelming odds. Hope persisted, fragile yet insistent, measured in shallow breaths and the courage to continue. Doctors recorded observations diligently, writing on frozen notebooks with trembling hands, ink barely adhering to damp pages. Frost rimmed the edges of paper, pens, and clipboards, reflecting pale light across tiny, precise movements. Soldiers assisted quietly, carrying trays of broth, blankets, and medications, careful not to disturb fragile patients. The bitter tang of antiseptic mixed with smoke and frost, pressing awareness into every breath. Children clutched blankets tightly, shivering yet absorbing gestures of care, tentative trust flickering in their eyes. Footsteps crunched softly across snow, echoing like a muted heartbeat through makeshift wards. Each note written, each observation recorded, preserved memory alongside life, a fragile link between evidence and survival. Frost glimmered along edges of blankets and instruments, emphasizing both cold and human perseverance. Shallow breaths, Weak pulses and small sighs became profound indicators of resilience. Every action, careful and deliberate, reinforced the fragile hope that sustained these wounded souls. In a corner, children huddled together, tiny hands intertwined as nurses spooned warm liquid into mouths too weak to lift cups alone. Frost collected on hair, collars, and mittens, reflecting pale, fractured sunlight over faces etched with exhaustion and tentative trust. The bitter tang of iron, smoke, and frost pressed subtly against senses, grounding each act of care in stark reality. Footsteps crunched softly across frozen earth, the rhythm echoing patience, vigilance, and urgent attention. Soldiers adjusted blankets, smoothed hair back from gaunt faces, and whispered gentle encouragements, bridging fear and fragile trust. Every spoonful, every soothing gesture carried monumental weight in the battle for survival. Frost glimmered along tent edges and nearby equipment, emphasizing fragility alongside human determination. Children's eyes flicked toward caregivers, absorbing warmth, attention, and care in small, essential doses. Each gesture of sustenance became both act of life and defiance against overwhelming despair. Fragile hope persisted, measured in breaths, spoonfuls, and the unspoken promise of survival. Medical teams improvised triage systems, prioritizing those most likely to endure, while documenting injuries, infections, and emaciation for future care. Frost-rimmed walls, floors, and instruments glinting under weak sunlight, emphasizing cold, scarcity, and urgency. Soldiers and medics moved deliberately, balancing speed with gentle care, aware of how tenuous each heartbeat had become. The bitter scent of antiseptic, sweat, and frozen earth pressed against senses, a constant reminder of both fragility and duty. Children watched quietly, absorbing gestures and process, silent witnesses to acts that would shape memory and history. Footsteps crunched softly on frozen ground, a muted rhythm against the hum of whispered encouragements and shallow breathing. Every observation, every recorded detail, transformed improvised care into enduring documentation. Frost clung to gloves, collars, and hair, highlighting delicate presence amid chaos. Nurses and doctors whispered instructions, their voices low yet resolute, guiding fragile patients through minute acts of survival. Hope, tempered by immense challenge, persisted quietly in each measured gesture and careful decision. Some survivors required delicate feeding, hands guiding spoons to mouths, encouraging small swallows as exhaustion pressed relentlessly. Frost sparkled along collars, blankets, and utensils, catching pale sunlight and emphasizing fragile warmth against pervasive cold. Soldiers watched attentively, ready to assist, observing subtle changes in skin tone, pulse, and responsiveness. The bitter tang of iron, frost, and faint smoke pressed into the air, grounding every gesture in stark reality. Children clutched blankets and each other, absorbing attention and care, small eyes reflecting both fatigue and tentative trust. Footsteps echoed softly, a measured rhythm of presence, vigilance, and deliberate action. Every small movement, raising a spoon, adjusting a blanket, offering a hand, carried profound consequence. Frost glimmered along edges of blankets and hair, highlighting human delicacy against the frozen backdrop. Nurses murmured encouragements, careful and deliberate, coaxing strength from fragile bodies. In every act of care, fragile hope persisted, resilient and insistently human. By evening, makeshift wards were quieter, patients settling into shallow, fragile sleep, blankets snug, breathing steady but shallow. Frost glimmered along edges of cots, hair, and collars, reflecting dim, fractured sunlight fading behind snow-covered ruins. Soldiers and medics moved carefully, checking pulse, warmth, and respiration, every action deliberate, measured, and reverent. The bitter tang of smoke, frost, and iron pressed subtly against senses, grounding awareness in reality and responsibility. Children huddled, small fingers intertwined, fragile warmth shared between trembling bodies and watchful caregivers. Footsteps crunched softly across frozen earth, punctuating silence with rhythm that mirrored vigilance and hope. Every shallow breath and fragile heartbeat became monumental, proof of endurance against systematic annihilation. Frost clung to blankets, clothing, and instruments, emphasizing delicacy, perseverance, and human fragility. Nurses whispered encouragement, guiding fragile bodies through the delicate balance of survival, recovery, and trust. Every saved heartbeat was a quiet defiance against death's empire. News of Auschwitz rippled outward from frozen fields and ruined barracks, carried by Red Army dispatches. Hand-scrawled reports and trembling film reels, European cities still scarred by conflict, absorbed these first accounts with incredulous silence. Editors unfolded dispatches at wooden desks, ink smudging on paper, breath misting in cold offices as fingers traced names, dates, and numbers that defied comprehension. Frost clung to window panes and cobblestones outside, mirroring the chill that seeped into hearts across nations. Journalists whispered in hallways, their voices low, as they pieced together fragments of horror into coherent stories. The bitter tang of ink, paper, and coal fires pressed against senses, grounding disbelief in tangible reality. Photographs, reels, and sketches arrived from the east, pale and ghostly in lamplight, each frame a frozen echo of unimaginable suffering. Footsteps of editors and messengers echoed softly, a rhythm of urgency and solemn responsibility. Every sentence typed, every headline considered, carried weight far beyond ordinary news. Across borders and oceans, the world began to sense the magnitude of systematic annihilation, tentative and overwhelmed. Newspapers rolled off presses in European capitals, ink still wet, headlines screaming names like Auschwitz, Birkenau, and Majdanek with stark precision. Frost-rimmed delivery trucks, pavements, and folded bundles glinting in fractured sunlight as they carried fragile truth to waiting eyes. Citizens pressed hands to printed sheets, reading aloud, voices trembling, disbelief clashing with the undeniable clarity of documentation. The bitter scent of ink, paper, and urban smoke underscored every hushed conversation in cafes, offices, and homes. Children overheard fragments, small voices questioning, absorbing fragments of fear and horror too vast for comprehension. Editors debated phrasing, layout, and imagery, conscious that every choice shaped perception and responsibility. Footsteps clattered across cold streets as messengers delivered bundles of proof to embassies, newspapers, and government offices. Shadows of late afternoon sun stretched across cobblestones and pavements, emphasizing scale and distance from the scenes themselves. Every photograph, reel, and report demanded attention, pressing the world to bear witness. Across Europe, disbelief mingled with moral reckoning, a fragile awakening to horrors previously whispered and dismissed. In Allied command centers, dispatches arrived with measured urgency, typed messages echoing with clipped formal tones yet containing details too grotesque for bureaucratic detachment. Frost-rimmed metal desks and telegraph keys glinting under harsh lamplight as officers read accounts of skeletal prisoners, crematoria, and piles of personal belongings. Soldiers paused to absorb each line, faces pale, fingers gripping edges of desks or railings in silent disbelief. The bitter tang of ink, paper, and coal smoke mingled with stale air, pressing weight into every breath. Conversations, low and hesitant, unfolded across rooms, analyzing evidence, questioning logistics, and grappling with human cruelty on industrial scale. Footsteps echoed through corridors, pacing and thoughtful, carrying fragments of news from one office to another. Photographs were pinned to walls, reels projected on screens, every image forcing comprehension of scale and intention. Frost sparkled across windows and metal equipment, mirroring the cold clarity of truth against moral shock. Children passing by noticed somber soldiers and whispered office discussions, absorbing fractured impressions of suffering beyond imagination. Across oceans, telegraphs, radios, and newspapers amplified the revelation, ensuring disbelief spread as swiftly as evidence itself. In Parisian cafes, men and women whispered names and numbers, gesturing toward printed photographs and grainy films displayed on tables. Frost clung to windowsills, cobblestones, and lamplight poles, echoing the chill that seeped into every soul encountering these accounts. The bitter tang of roasted coffee mingled with ink, paper, and winter air, blending comfort with the disquiet of emerging truth. Journalists debated phrasing, images, and editorial tone, balancing urgency against shock, precision against moral outrage. Footsteps of pedestrians clattered across streets, a subtle rhythm accompanying hushed conversations over newspapers. Children lingered near adults, small faces pale with curiosity, hearing fragments of atrocities beyond their years. Photographs and reports were carefully unfolded, held to sunlight or flickering lamps to catch every detail in fragile clarity. Shadows stretched long over frozen streets and sidewalks, reinforcing the vast distance between ordinary life and industrialized horror. Every whispered story, typed line, and printed photograph contributed to collective understanding, tentative but urgent. Across Europe, disbelief and moral shock mingled, a complex prelude to comprehension and accountability. In London, newsrooms buzzed with tension, teletypes clattering across frozen floors as reports from Poland arrived in fragmented clarity. Frost glimmered along window panes and radiator pipes, echoing the cold weight of new truths entering hearts and offices. Editors and reporters paused mid-sentence, eyes tracing words and images that defied imagination, skeletal remains and abandoned belongings etched into memory. The bitter tang of ink, paper, and coal fires lingered, pressing urgency into every movement and conversation. Footsteps echoed through high-ceilinged rooms, punctuating urgent discussions of phrasing, priority, and historical responsibility. Photographs were pinned, projected, and examined, each frame demanding attention and comprehension. Children glanced at adults with tentative curiosity, absorbing fragments of horror and human resilience through hushed voices and gestures. Shadows stretched across office floors, emphasizing the vast distance between sanitized reports and the reality of frozen, ruined camps. Every typed word and every printed image became a bridge between worlds, connecting distant observers to the immediate human tragedy. Across oceans and borders, the name Auschwitz began to echo like thunder from afar. In Berlin, whispers traveled through shadowed streets and hushed apartments, citizens piecing together fragments from intercepted reports, underground publications, and rumors. Frost clung to broken railings, cobblestones, and abandoned street corners, mirroring the chill of revelation and fear pressing inward. The bitter tang of smoke, coal, and ink underscored conversations held in low tones, muffled yet urgent, as disbelief intertwined with dread. Footsteps echoed softly in hallways and across cold streets, a rhythm of rumor, reflection, and tentative acknowledgement. Citizens exchanged folded papers, photographs, and sketches, fingers trembling as they traced skeletal forms and piles of abandoned belongings. Children overheard small whispers, eyes wide, absorbing glimpses of incomprehensible cruelty. Shadows stretched along ruined streets and alleyways, amplifying both scale and distance between ordinary life and systemic atrocity. Every shared detail pressed urgency and moral reckoning into minds demanding attention despite discomfort. Photographs and film reels circulated quietly, evidence crossing borders even as disbelief persisted. Across Germany and occupied territories, stunned recognition mingled with fear, forging the earliest threads of collective memory. In New York and Washington, journalists pored over incoming cables, maps, and photographs, translating frost-bound European reports into headlines for a world only beginning to grasp horror. Frost glimmered across window panes, streets, and typewriter keys, reflecting fragmented sunlight in offices filled with muted urgency. The bitter tang of ink, paper, and coal smoke pressed subtly against senses, grounding abstract tragedy in tangible evidence. Footsteps echoed along hallways as editors, clerks, and typists moved with deliberation, balancing accuracy, timeliness, and sensitivity. Children overheard snatches of conversation, absorbing fragments of disbelief and moral shock through hurried editorial voices. Photographs, film frames, and maps were spread across desks, revealing skeletal prisoners, abandoned shoes, and scorched structures in frozen permanence. Shadows stretched across office floors, emphasizing distance, responsibility, and weight of awareness. Every typed line, every headline carried responsibility far beyond ordinary news, translating frozen truth into public consciousness. Frost-rimmed desks, instruments, and paperwork reflecting the fragile clarity of information arriving from afar. Across oceans and borders, the name Auschwitz began to echo like thunder from afar. By evening, dispatches, photographs, and films converged in newsrooms, government offices, and embassies, forming a fragile but undeniable record. Frost glittered along windowsills, pavements, and mail crates, echoing the cold, sharp clarity of emerging truth. The bitter tang of ink, paper, and coal fires pressed into every breath and gesture, binding disbelief to moral reckoning. Footsteps crunched softly across frozen streets outside, mirroring quiet urgency within offices and presses. Editors, clerks, and soldiers worked in concert, arranging images, verifying reports, and translating horror into digestible yet unflinching narratives. Children listened from thresholds and windows, faces pale, witnessing adults struggling to comprehend and communicate what had been hidden for years. Shadows stretched long across office floors, walls, and cobblestones, framing the magnitude of evidence as simultaneously distant and immediate. Each photograph, film reel, and dispatch carried moral weight, pressing the world toward acknowledgement and action. Every shared detail, whispered rumor, and printed headline became a conduit of collective memory and conscience. Across oceans and borders, the name Auschwitz began to echo like thunder from afar. Captured SS officers sat stiffly in frost-lined cells, their hands bound, faces pale beneath harsh electric light, while shadows of past atrocities lingered behind barred windows. Frost clung to metal doors, stone floors, and wooden benches, mirroring the cold accountability waiting outside. Interrogators approached with quiet authority, questions measured yet unrelenting, pressing each officer to recount deeds that stained history. The bitter tang of paper, ink, and tobacco smoke mixed with distant exhaust from armored vehicles, grounding each scene in reality. Footsteps echoed along stone corridors, a rhythm of tension and determination, punctuated by the low murmur of whispered recollections. Each confession, half-revealed truth, or deflected answer, carried monumental consequence, bridging memory, evidence, and emerging justice. Prisoners, witnesses, and medics had once survived the camp. Now they observed testimony sharpened by suffering, eyes fixed and unflinching. Frost glimmered along ledges and bars, highlighting the fragile clarity that justice demanded. Every question asked became both revelation and moral assertion. In courtrooms, the shadows of Auschwitz faced the fragile light of justice. Interrogation rooms filled with hushed tension, the metallic scent of pens, paper, and sweat hanging in the air. Officers shifted uneasily under direct gaze, recounting names, orders, and methods with mechanical precision. Frost-rimmed windows and cold radiator pipes accentuating the stark, unyielding atmosphere. Witnesses watched silently, their breaths shallow, hands trembling, recalling horrors etched into memory with surgical accuracy. The bitter tang of ink, coal smoke, and cold stone pressed against senses, embedding every word into enduring consciousness. Footsteps of guards and clerks punctuated the low hum of conversation, creating rhythm alongside measured questions and careful documentation. Prisoners once tormented now narrated, voices steady yet weighted, each syllable carrying history forward. Frost glimmered across furniture and instruments, emphasizing the contrast between the warmth of moral resolve and the cold of architectural cruelty. Each statement became evidence, a thread weaving together accountability and memory. Justice, though nascent, pressed inexorably forward through careful documentation and relentless inquiry. In Krakow's austere courtrooms, first trials unfolded beneath high ceilings and cold stone floors. Sunlight fractured through frost-coated windows. Captured officers faced rows of judges, interpreters, and reporters, the bitter tang of ink, dust, and coal smoke pressing against senses. Footsteps echoed across marble floors as lawyers consulted notes, witnesses positioned themselves, and clerks adjusted documents with quiet precision. Survivors entered with measured steps, eyes reflecting past suffering yet carrying a fragile resolve, every glance heavy with memory. Frost-rimmed benches, railings, and documents reinforcing the chill of history confronting those present. The bitter hum of murmured conversation punctuated solemn proclamations, whispers mingling with the scratch of pens. Officers appeared rigid, faces pale, struggling to reconcile obedience with consequences now laid bare. Photographs, maps, and survivor statements were presented, assembling a mosaic of cruelty and systematic terror. Every revelation, every corroboration, drew gasps or silent nods from the audience, moral shock palpable, justice, deliberate yet painstaking, edged forward, illuminating the shadows once hidden behind barbed wire. Interrogators moved between small, drafty rooms, balancing pressure with careful observation, cataloguing each confession and denial. Frost clung to door frames, papers, and clothing, glinting faintly in dim electric light. The bitter tang of antiseptic, coal smoke, and ink pressed subtly against senses, reminding all present of the cold machinery of both atrocity and accountability. Witnesses recounted details meticulously, eyes unblinking, hands steady, their trauma shaping clarity of narrative. Footsteps crunched along stone corridors, a muted rhythm behind the precise articulation of events. Officers' faces betrayed tension and avoidance, micro-expressions betraying memory's burden and fear's persistence. Frost-rimmed instruments, chairs, and papers, emphasizing delicate balance between human frailty and institutional procedure. Every detail, down to the timing of orders or locations of deaths, became crucial evidence in the architecture of justice. Testimony flowed like a river, slow, deliberate, yet carrying immense force and consequence. The fragile machinery of moral reckoning pressed on, relentless in its pursuit of truth. Captured guards, once instruments of cruelty, now confronted both paper and witness, recounting routines of control and moments of violence with mechanical precision. Frost-rimmed desks, doors, and clipboards catching fractured sunlight as testimonies were meticulously recorded. The bitter tang of ink, smoke, and cold stone pressed against senses, grounding each word in stark reality. Witnesses observed closely, their expressions carved from years of trauma and endurance, ensuring accuracy and accountability. Footsteps of clerks and investigators punctuated the low murmur of dialogue, a rhythm of documentation and scrutiny. Every hesitation, repeated phrase, or slip of memory became crucial, shaping the evidentiary chain. Frost clung to instruments, papers and edges of benches, emphasizing fragility alongside moral clarity. Officers' voices trembled under cross-examination, revealing cracks in armor built from fear and ideology. Each recorded confession became both testimony and moral judgment. The light of accountability, slow yet persistent, illuminated shadows long shrouded in darkness. In waiting rooms, survivors conferred quietly, sharing recollections, reaffirming details, and offering each other courage against the enormity of what was unfolding. Frost glimmered on benches, windows, and worn coats, reflecting sunlight in fragmented patterns across solemn faces. The bitter tang of ink, paper, and faint coal smoke pervaded air, heavy with anticipation and memory. Footsteps echoed softly along hallways, punctuating hushed exchanges and quiet preparations for testimony. Each whispered account, each careful revision, strengthened the chain of evidence awaiting court presentation. Officers sat rigidly in nearby rooms, unaware of the precision with which witnesses were fortifying the case against them. Frost-rimmed ledgers, clipboards, and notebooks, emphasizing both the chill of justice and the warmth of survivor resolve. Every minute spent in preparation became a rehearsal of courage, translating memory into actionable truth. The weight of history pressed forward in measured steps, deliberate and exacting. Fragile resolve met deliberate procedure, forging the beginnings of moral reckoning. Lawyers presented maps, photographs, and documents in courtroom corridors, assembling evidence that crystallized systematic atrocity with clinical precision. Frost-rimmed wooden benches, metal railings, and paper edges catching light that fractured across solemn faces. The bitter tang of ink, coal smoke, and damp stone underscored every movement, pressing focus onto details both intimate and monstrous. Footsteps echoed across marble floors as clerks, reporters, and assistants moved between exhibits and witnesses. Survivors watched closely, ensuring every narrative aligned with truth, their silence heavy with authority. Officers shifted uneasily, noting the meticulous organization of facts and photographs that stripped away denial. Frost glimmered on instruments, desks, and rails, emphasizing delicate human presence alongside procedural rigor. Every detail presented became evidence, a moral claim recorded for history and posterity. The rhythm of court and testimony merged with the cold precision of documentation, relentless yet deliberate. Justice, slow and measured, pressed into spaces once dominated by cruelty. Final judgments began to take form, sentences pronounced in halls echoing with frost-laden sunlight through tall windows. The bitter tang of ink, coal, and smoke pressed against senses, marking both culmination and beginning. Footsteps echoed softly in marble corridors as officers received sentences, witnesses observed, and reporters recorded. Frost-rimmed benches, doors, and paper edges catching fractured light across solemn, resolute faces. The courtroom remained silent between proclamations, each word measured and profound, the weight of lives and deeds rendered in formal language. Survivors exhaled quietly, a mixture of relief, grief, and enduring trauma etched into posture and expression. Every recorded sentence, every spoken verdict, carved memory into law, bridging human suffering and societal accountability. Frost glimmered along instruments and documents, emphasizing fragility alongside unyielding consequence. Officers faced outcomes that surpassed personal survival, confronting history, witness, and morality. In courtrooms, the shadows of Auschwitz faced the fragile light of justice. The survivors emerged from Auschwitz with bodies still fragile and spirits heavy, stepping into a world that had moved on without them. Frost clung to the edges of train stations, wooden benches and iron railings, mirroring the emptiness of streets and homes left behind. Displaced persons camps sprawled across fields and abandoned factories, tents and wooden huts holding fragile lives in provisional safety. The bitter tang of smoke, boiled soup and coal fires mingled with the cold, pressing the weight of reality onto every breath. Footsteps crunched across frozen dirt and gravel paths as men and women moved between registration tables, lists of names clutched tightly in trembling hands. Each face searched for family, neighbors or friends, scanning the lines of survivors and the columns of paper with desperate hope. Children shivered beneath blankets, eyes wide and empty, holding on to small remnants of clothing or toys. Frost glimmered on tents, crates and fences, reflecting the thin sunlight as if hesitant to fully illuminate these fragile havens. Volunteers and Red Cross personnel moved with quiet efficiency, distributing rations, blankets and scarce medicines. Freedom had come, yet for many the world outside was just another exile. At the crowded camp gates, families long dissolved were sought among strangers, every new face a possibility or heartbreak. Frost-rimmed metal gates and wooden posts sparkling under pale morning light, contrasting with the tension in human hearts. The bitter tang of coal smoke, firewood and ink permeated the camp as lists of names were read aloud. Some answered with tears, others with silence. Footsteps echoed along narrow paths between tents, accompanied by the low murmur of whispered hopes and despair. Children clutched small bundles, their frail bodies swaying in rhythm with their caregivers' tentative steps. Each inquiry, each recognition became a fragile thread stitching the past to a tenuous present. Frost-rimmed benches, crates and wooden signposts glinting as if the landscape itself mourned absence. Volunteers recorded every reunion and every void with quiet precision, understanding the weight of memory against the cold reality. Even as faces brightened, the hollowness of missing family echoed louder than relief. The survivors' gaze reached beyond the camp's wire, seeking a world that no longer remembered them. Train stations stood empty and towns long liberated, platforms strewn with the detritus of hastened flight and abandonment. Frost-rimmed metal rails, station benches and ticket windows, reflecting the fragile light of dawn across deserted spaces. The bitter tang of coal smoke, ink, and soot lingered in the air, mixing with the muted calls of crows and distant train whistles. Footsteps crunched over frost-hardened gravel as survivors scoured timetables and notice boards, searching for names, trains, and possible destinations. Each arrival or departure brought fleeting hope or sharp disappointment. Human motion against silent architecture. Children clung to thin coats and rationed food, eyes wide and faces pale, absorbing the incomprehensible scale of absence. Frost glimmered on signs, roofs, and rails, refracting sunlight into fractured patterns across weary faces. Volunteers directed, advised, and comforted, yet their words could only lightly temper the vastness of loss. Every empty platform, every abandoned train car became a silent witness to absence and the slow reconstruction of human connection. Freedom had come, yet for many the world outside was just another exile. Within the tents and wooden barracks of the camps, small fires crackled against the frost-laden walls, providing heat yet failing to warm fractured hearts. Frost-lined windows, bunks and supply crates, shimmering in the flickering glow of lanterns. The bitter tang of coal smoke, boiled rations and damp wood pressed against senses, grounding survivors in the provisional nature of refuge. Footsteps of aid workers and camp personnel echoed softly, carrying blankets, medicines and meager comfort to waiting bodies. Children clutched each other, drawing warmth and courage from fragile human connection. Each blanket wrapped, each spoon of broth offered, became both sustenance and affirmation of continued life. Frost-rimmed utensils, tables and window ledges, highlighting the delicate balance of survival in the cold aftermath. Voices rose in quiet conversation, names repeated, histories recalled, forming tenuous bonds across generational and cultural divides. Every day in the camp became a negotiation between memory, need, and fragile hope. The survivors lived in moments of warmth framed by the unyielding frost outside, caught between past horrors and uncertain futures. Searching for lost homes and families, survivors moved through towns and cities with hollow eyes, encountering boarded houses and silent streets. Frost clung to windows, door frames, and cobblestones, accentuating abandonment and absence. The bitter tang of ink, coal smoke, and burned wood pressed into every inhalation, mixing with the faint scent of urban decay. Footsteps echoed in alleyways, squares, and train yards, each step a tentative probe into a world now foreign and hostile. Children walked beside adults carrying the weight of memory and fragments of vanished homes. Each closed door, each missing name, reinforced the depth of loss that liberation could not erase. Frost-rimmed street signs, vehicles, and lamp posts, catching fractured light across empty facades. Volunteers and relief workers followed, documenting absence, offering guidance, and attempting to bridge the gap between past and present. Every encounter, every street corner, became a microcosm of exile and endurance. Freedom had come, yet for many the world outside was just another exile. Across makeshift kitchens and supply lines, survivors waited for rations, medical attention, and guidance, to find possible destinations beyond immediate camps. Frost-rimmed crates, tables, and utensils glinting in the weak winter sunlight that filtered through tents. The bitter tang of boiled rations, wood smoke, and ink mixed with cold air, pressing against senses with quiet insistence. Footsteps crunched over frozen earth as queues formed, each movement tentative and deliberate. Children clutched tiny bundles, eyes flicking between caretakers and passing soldiers. Every distributed meal, every whispered instruction carried symbolic weight far beyond nutrition or direction. Frost-rimmed cooking utensils, storage crates, and benches, reflecting light that seemed almost hesitant in these fragile spaces. Conversations between survivors, volunteers, and officials navigated trauma, hope, and practical necessity, fragile bridges of understanding. Each ration, each carefully measured gift of warmth, became a sign that life could persist despite absence. The world remained a fractured place, yet small acts of care provided tenuous connection and sustenance. In the quiet of camp evenings, survivors huddled beneath blankets, speaking softly of names, places, and memories that survived war's erasure. Frost-rimmed tents, bunks, and makeshift windows, sparkling under faint lantern light as shadows shifted across weary faces. The bitter tang of coal smoke, ink, and boiled food lingered, mingling with the scent of damp clothing and human presence. Footsteps of night patrols and aid workers echoed softly, a rhythm of vigilance and care. Children clutched each other, whispering stories of vanished homes, drawing warmth and courage from human proximity. Every whispered recollection, every recounted name became a fragment of reconstruction, both fragile and resilient. Frost glimmered on ledges, utensils, and furniture, casting fractured reflections across eyes weary with loss and longing. Volunteers moved quietly, checking for fever, rationing blankets, and ensuring minimal comfort in a world still foreign and hostile. Each night survived became both an endurance and a lesson in adaptation, a rehearsal for life beyond the camp. Freedom had come, yet for many the world outside was just another exile. By dawn, hope and despair mingled as survivors prepared for movement beyond camps, uncertain if the next station, city, or country would offer welcome or rejection. Frost-rimmed streets, gates, and platforms catching the first fractured light of day, reflecting fragmented futures. The bitter tang of coal smoke, ink, and cooked rations lingered as trains awaited, carrying people toward unknown destinations. Footsteps echoed across frozen gravel as men, women, and children gathered possessions, documents, and fragile courage. Volunteers coordinated departures, ensuring some guidance yet leaving ultimate destinations largely undefined. Children held hands tightly, eyes wide at the vast expanse of possibilities and peril. Frost glimmered across crates, rails, and signage, emphasizing fragility and hope intertwined. Each boarding, each farewell carried emotional weight, bridging memories, survival, and the tentative promise of future life. Footsteps faded into distance, leaving behind echoes of absence and endurance on frost-laden platforms. Freedom had come, yet for many the world outside was just another exile. The barbed wire surrounding Auschwitz still glinted in the weak morning light, a rigid reminder of what once controlled life and death within its perimeter. Rain fell in soft sheets, soaking the muddy paths between crumbling barracks, and the scent of wet timber and iron mingled with the lingering smoke of burned records. Locals moved past cautiously, eyes downcast, whispering to themselves about events that had scarred both land and conscience. Footsteps squelched in puddles, echoing softly as memories collided with silence, the weight of absence pressing against the chill air. Barracks sagged under time and weather, windows shattered, doors hanging askew, their skeletal forms both fragile and stubborn. The bitter tang of damp wood, rusting metal, and cold earth pressed into every inhalation, grounding reflection in tangible ruin. Flowers left at makeshift memorials glistened with rain, their color vivid against muted stone and decaying brick. Visitors lingered, hands clasped, faces pale, speaking softly in languages stitched together by shared grief and curiosity. Frost began to settle in corners untouched by rain, reflecting light across walls etched with graffiti and etched memories. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. Inside the main camp, the skeletal outlines of gas chambers loomed beneath low clouds, shadows stretching across rain-slicked paths. The bitter tang of wet cement, moss, and distant smoke clung to senses, echoing faintly of horrors no one could forget. Footsteps echoed as historians and early visitors traced the contours of former barracks and crematoria, each step measured against the weight of collective remembrance. Locals whispered, pointing to remnants of walls, chimneys, and barbed wire, recounting partial recollections of forced labor and evacuations. Children wandered, guided by parents or teachers, their eyes wide at structures too large to fully comprehend, yet too stark to ignore. Frost glimmered on puddles, moss, and shattered window panes, refracting pale sunlight into fragmented patterns over broken stone. Each rain-laden roof, sagging beam, and scorched timber told a story in silence, a chronicle of endurance, atrocity, and grief. Volunteers cleaned pathways, arranging stones and small markers to guide visitors through both space and history. Every tread across frozen mud, every lowered gaze at ruins became an act of acknowledgement, a bridge between absence and memory. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. Flowers and small candles began to accumulate along pathways where prisoners had once marched, their colors vivid against gray concrete. The bitter tang of wet blooms, earth, and faint smoke mingled in the rain-soaked air, a sensory tapestry of tribute and mourning. Footsteps of visitors echoed softly on gravel, punctuated by hushed speech. Muted sobs and the scrape of worn shoes. Barracks sagged under weather, their timbers wet and dark, whispering history through cracks and warped planks. Children laid small stones atop graves and markers, hands trembling, learning early lessons in reflection and moral memory. Frost glimmered across metal fences, memorial plaques, and puddles, refracting light as if the ruins themselves acknowledged the tribute. Each flower left became a token of continuity, a fragile proof that the lives erased would not vanish from collective conscience. Local guides whispered names and histories, threading narrative into space where silence might otherwise dominate. Every echo of voice, every gesture of remembrance, reinforced the fragile architecture of moral reckoning. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. At the entrance gate, early visitors paused, observing the camp's scale and layout, attempting to reconcile imagination with reality. Frost-rimmed iron rails and wooden gate posts sparkling faintly beneath leaden clouds, the bitter tang of cold iron, rain, and distant smoke pressed against senses, emphasizing the permanence of physical structures even as memories shifted and expanded. Footsteps crunched over gravel as groups moved inward, guided by maps, lists, and local witnesses, each step a careful negotiation with space and history. Barracks, once filled with sound and suffering, now stood silent, walls cracked and roofs sagging, absorbing light and shadow in equal measure. Children trailed behind adults, fingers brushing rails and stones, absorbing both scale and absence, learning the weight of human consequence. Frost clung to plaques, metal signs and benches, catching fractured sunlight that refracted across eyes both old and young. Each pause, each careful observation became an act of moral reflection, a meditation on atrocity and endurance. Visitors traced steps across frozen paths, remembering, imagining, and learning. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. In the ruins of workshops and storage sheds, remnants of prisoners' labor stood as mute testimony to daily endurance and exploitation. Frost settled over rusting machinery, splintered beams and waterlogged floors, highlighting the starkness of absence. The bitter tang of damp metal, wood, and faint smoke hung in the air, pressing a quiet insistence of historical truth. Footsteps echoed softly as guides pointed to broken tools, stacks of pallets, and scorched remnants of barracks furniture. Children listened intently, their small faces absorbing the enormity of work forced from bodies weakened by starvation and fear. Each rusted nail, each warped plank, became a fragment of narrative, connecting action to consequence, labor to atrocity. Frost-rimmed equipment, shelves, and beams glinting under one light, emphasizing fragility and persistence alike. Visitors paused, sketching, photographing, or simply standing in silence, bearing witness to endurance etched into stone and timber. Every gesture, every act of observation became a bridge between lived horror and collective remembrance. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. Rain pooled in long trenches and empty foundations where prisoners had once assembled, working under watchful eyes. Frost clung to mud, puddles, and edges of stone foundations, reflecting the fractured light of a hesitant winter sun. The bitter tang of wet soil, wood, and faint smoke pressed subtly into consciousness, evoking both tactile and moral resonance. Footsteps of visitors echoed across these spaces, careful not to disturb fragile ground that held layers of unspoken history. Guides whispered stories of marches, labor, and terror, their voices low but precise, bridging silence and memory. Children crouched to leave small stones or flowers, understanding in a fragmentary way the scale of human loss. Frost glimmered on edges of trenches, stones, and broken boards, accentuating the interplay of time, decay, and remembrance. Each footfall became an act of reflection, a meditation on absence and presence coexisting in the same frame. The camp's quiet expanse carried memory in every puddle, every warped plank, every rain-darkened wall. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. Along the perimeter, barbed wire sagged and rusted, marking boundaries that once contained lives, now absorbing observation instead of terror. Frost glimmered along strands, catching sparse light in fractured patterns across frozen ground. The bitter tang of rust, damp earth and rain pressed subtly into the senses, a reminder of both physical and moral containment. Footsteps of visitors, historians and locals echoed softly along paths, reverent yet curious, mapping space and history simultaneously. Barracks crumbled in the rain, their skeletal walls bowing under the weight of time and neglect, each timber whispering a story of endurance. Children sketched, noted, or simply stood, observing scale, texture, and absence, forming memory through both reflection and action. Frost-rimmed plaques, benches, and broken posts, catching light that fractured across eyes wide with comprehension. Every careful movement, every gesture of tribute, strengthened memory's hold upon space, translating history into personal and collective reckoning. Visitors lingered, absorbing scale, shadow, and silence, walking in step with time itself. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. In the quiet hours when visitors departed and rain softened to mist, the camp settled into its own rhythm of reflection. Frost clung to broken roofs, railings, and stones, shimmering faintly under one sunlight filtered through heavy clouds. The bitter tang of wet wood, rusting metal, and coal smoke remained, grounding the place in tangible reality even as imagination filled voids. Footsteps faded, leaving only the quiet drip of rain and the faint creak of weakened timbers. Barracks sagged, chimneys leaned, and foundations held stories in every crack, every warped plank. Birds moved cautiously above, their wings brushing cold air, unaware yet quietly marking time in a landscape of memory. Frost glimmered across puddles, railings, and remnants of barbed wire, reflecting light in fractured patterns across empty spaces. Every fallen beam, every stone, every trace of human presence became testimony, preserved by nature and human attention alike. The silence, punctuated by wind and water, held witness to both horror and endurance. Among decaying walls, memory rooted itself deeper than stone. Decades after liberation, survivors gathered in quiet living rooms, their voices low but unwavering, as they recounted memories etched into every cell of their being. Faded photographs lay scattered across tables, corners curling, edges darkened by time, showing faces both lost and remembered. The faint tang of old paper, dust, and waxed wood filled the air, mixing with the warmth of candlelight and quiet winter mornings. Children leaned forward, small hands clasped, eyes wide with curiosity and awe, absorbing stories too vast for full comprehension. Footsteps echoed softly across wooden floors as family members moved between rooms, retrieving objects, letters, and relics that bridged the past with the present. Each story, every whispered recollection became both an act of survival and a ritual of remembrance, grounding history in intimate human terms. Frost-laden windows framed winter light, casting long fractured shadows across walls lined with trophies of endurance and loss. Old voices trembled with emotion, pausing to remember names, dates, and gestures lost to the march of time. Every inhalation of air in these spaces carried memory, reverberating across generations with a gravity that exceeded years. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. In early recording studios and archives, survivors recounted events with deliberate precision, their tones steady but eyes betraying faint tremors of memory. Microphones captured the cadence of their words, preserving tremors, pauses, and inflections for posterity. The faint tang of ink, polished wood, and varnish mingled with warmth from studio lamps, creating a cocoon for testimony. Technicians adjusted dials, rewound reels, and scribbled notes, each movement reverent and precise. Footsteps of archivists echoed across linoleum floors, accompanied by the soft rustle of paper and the click of film reels. Faded photographs, yellowed letters, and ration cards were carefully catalogued, their edges worn from decades of handling and recollection. Every story told, every frame captured, became an artifact of resilience, bridging the divide between lived horror and historical memory. Frost pressed against studio windows, glinting faintly, a reminder of seasons passing outside as narratives endured within. Each recorded testimony became a conduit, connecting the past to a future, yet to fully understand its weight. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. Across classrooms in post-war Europe, children listened intently to guest survivors, the faint tang of chalk dust and waxed floors mixing with heavy breaths and hushed anticipation. Eyes wide, they absorbed accounts of camps, marches, and survival, their imaginations grappling with scales of cruelty and endurance. Footsteps of teachers and historians moved softly between rows, guiding comprehension while honoring the gravity of each narrative. Drawings, maps, and timelines covered walls, annotated in careful handwriting, linking abstract history to human faces. Frost glimmered on windowsills, reflecting pale sunlight across desks lined with notebooks and pencils. Every question posed, every pause observed, bridged empathy with understanding, forming moral continuity across generations. Children's hands rose hesitantly, touching objects passed down for storytelling, feeling weight in textures, letters, and photographs. Soft laughter occasionally broke through tense silence, a fragile affirmation of resilience intertwined with horror. Each classroom session became a living archive, a conduit of memory that resisted erosion by time or denial. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. Survivors traveled across continents, their voices echoing in halls of museums and memorials, recounting life, death, and the quiet persistence of hope. Frost-rimmed metal railings and concrete steps outside, highlighting seasonal transitions as they carried lessons forward. The faint tang of waxed floors, polished wood, and printed paper mingled with the distant hum of city streets, grounding narrative in lived reality. Footsteps echoed in vaulted corridors, each step a cadence of remembrance, each pause a moment of moral reflection. Photographs and exhibits bore silent witness, their frames filled with eyes staring from beyond time and place. Children and adults alike absorbed stories, tracing walls, reading plaques, and standing in reverence before objects both mundane and extraordinary. Frost glimmered faintly in windows high above exhibition halls, refracting sunlight onto faces attentive and contemplative. Every question, every interaction became a form of dialogue with the past, a living testament to both survival and duty. Exhibits and voices intertwined, forming a tapestry of remembrance stronger than stone or paper alone. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. In quiet homes, survivors displayed photographs of children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, bridging time with visible proof of life enduring beyond destruction. Frost glimmered on window panes, casting fractured reflections across faces lined with both grief and triumph. The faint tang of dust, ink, and old wood mixed with the warmth of kitchens and hearths, a sensory layering of past and present. Footsteps of family members traced hallways, pausing to examine framed documents and medals of endurance. Letters yellowed with age were read aloud, connecting absent voices with living presence, a bridge across years. Children leaned forward, touching edges of photographs, feeling faint warmth in textures and paper, absorbing narrative as both lesson and responsibility. Frost shimmered on objects left near windowsills, reflecting light across attentive eyes. Every recollection spoken, every document held, became a living thread linking generations in memory and conscience. Homes became both sanctuary and archive, each room a locus of reflection, survival, and witness. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. In lecture halls and auditoriums, survivors addressed crowds large and small, the air charged with anticipation and quiet awe. Frost-rimmed window edges outside, soft light filtering through shades and curtains, illuminating rows of attentive faces, the faint tang of ink, polished wood, and overused microphones mingled with warm air filled by hundreds of breaths. Footsteps moved along aisles as audience members shifted, leaned forward, and adjusted in empathy, absorbing every pause, sigh, and cadence. Children and adults alike scribbled notes, drew connections, and whispered reflections, bridging memory with immediate understanding. Frost glimmered faintly along the tops of seats and windowsills, echoing the persistence of recollection against temporal decay. Every story told, every historical point emphasized, reinforced moral continuity, threading human responsibility through the fabric of time. Survivors' voices trembled at moments, steadied at others, carrying authority born from lived experience. The audience left with steps slowed, hearts heavy, and minds attentive, bearing witness to a past they could never fully inhabit, yet were now duty-bound to preserve. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. Across documentaries, early films, and recorded interviews, voices of survivors became immortalized in black and white and color, moving images and sound. Frost glimmered along studio windows, reflecting muted sun as reels turned and cameras rolled. The faint tang of old film, wax and smoke-laden air mixed with anticipation and reverence. Footsteps of crew and historians moved quietly between lights and microphones, careful not to disturb authenticity. Every gesture, pause, and glance was captured, preserving not only words but the emotional weight behind them. Children and grandchildren later watched these recordings, absorbing narrative through mediated yet intimate connection. Frost shimmered on frames and edges of film reels, echoing the fragile persistence of memory across decades. Each playback became both lesson and ritual, bridging absence with presence in a continuity of moral witness. Recorded voices intertwined with living memory, threading generations through story, testimony, and reflection. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. In cemeteries, memorials, and quiet corners of homes, the legacy of survivors endured through ritual, remembrance, and quiet daily reflection. Frost-rimmed headstones, railings, and garden beds catching weak sunlight and refracting light across names etched into stone. The faint tang of earth, flowers, and burning candles mixed with the warmth of human presence, grounding reflection in physicality. Footsteps moved carefully among paths, pausing, leaning, touching stones, and leaving tokens of acknowledgement. Photographs, letters, and small mementos lay beside graves or in frames, tangible proof of lives remembered and transmitted. Children and grandchildren absorbed rituals of memory, learning gestures of care, responsibility, and moral attention. Frost glimmered across memorial plaques, benches, and flower pots, highlighting the fragile permanence of tribute against temporal decay. Every act of remembrance, every spoken name became a link between survival, witness, and legacy. Across continents, rooms, and landscapes, memory persisted, resilient, ethical, and human. What they carried was not just survival, but the duty to speak for the silenced. Snow fell in soft, whispering sheets across the grounds of Auschwitz, settling over rails, broken tracks, and the skeletal outlines of barracks. Modern visitors walked carefully beneath the infamous gate, their breaths visible in the crisp winter air, merging with the faint tang of damp earth and rusting metal. Footsteps crunched in soft rhythm across frozen pathways, echoing in spaces once filled with terror and silence alike. Candles flickered atop small memorials, their light wavering against grey stone and the shadowed walls of buildings scarred by time. The bitter tang of candle wax, damp wood, and distant smoke pressed subtly into consciousness, a sensory reminder of what transpired and what endures. Guides spoke softly, narrating stories of survival, death, and resilience, their voices blending with wind and occasional bird call. Frost glimmered on iron railings, broken bricks, and the edges of memorial plaques, refracting pale light into fractured patterns across attentive faces. Each gaze, each careful step became both witness and reflection, an acknowledgement that history persists even as generations pass. Visitors lingered, pausing before the ruins, absorbing scale, shadow, and moral weight. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember. Inside the camp, the skeletal remains of barracks and watchtowers absorbed winter light with quiet gravity, their silhouettes etched against soft grey skies. Snow piled along roofs and foundations, muffling sound and softening the harsh lines of metal and timber. The faint tang of iron, damp wood, and lingering coal smoke pressed gently into awareness, connecting past atrocity with present remembrance. Footsteps of visitors echoed across frozen mud, careful and measured, as if the earth itself demanded reverence. Children's voices, quiet and tentative, rose as guides explained, translating horror into lessons of empathy and responsibility. Frost-rimmed windows, doors, and broken timbers sparkling faintly, emphasizing both fragility and endurance. Each photograph, each artifact placed on display became a living conduit, linking observation with memory, and memory with moral reflection. The quiet wind stirred remnants of barbed wire, producing low, mournful sounds that resonated with history's weight. Every gesture, from kneeling to photographing, became an act of witness, an assertion that silence alone could not carry the past. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember. At the crematoria, candles burned on snow-covered ground, their faint scent blending with cold air and the subtle tang of stone, warmed briefly by winter sun. Footsteps crunched lightly over frozen mud and gravel as visitors traced paths between foundations, imagining lives once forced into routines of horror. Frost glimmered on bricks, iron fittings, and surrounding fences, catching pale light and scattering it across attentive faces. Guides recounted both scale and method, carefully balancing detail with the emotional weight of testimony, leaving space for reflection. Children stood silently beside adults, small hands touching plaques and memorial stones, learning the contours of moral inheritance. The faint tang of damp timber and smoke from distant chimneys mingled with candle aroma, creating a sensory link to memory. Each photograph and record displayed nearby was a fragment of human endurance, a bridge between lived experience and contemporary understanding. Snow drifted lightly across rail lines leading toward the camp, echoing past transports and lives displaced. Every pause in movement, every lowered gaze reinforced the gravity of presence and witness. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember. In the watchtowers, frost traced delicate patterns across broken windows, catching muted sunlight in tiny refracted prisms. The bitter tang of rust, ice, and aged timber pressed subtly into perception, anchoring visitors in a space both historical and ethical. Footsteps of visitors on surrounding paths merged with wind whistling through skeletal structures, producing a haunting cadence of remembrance. Children and adults leaned over railings, peering down at foundations, imagining lives constrained by cruelty and fear. Every wooden beam, rusted nail, and scorched brick conveyed weight beyond the visible, embedding history into material itself. Frost glimmered on barbed wire coils, posts, and edges of memorials, emphasizing permanence and fragility simultaneously. Guides whispered stories of guards, prisoners, and quiet acts of defiance, threading moral reflection into observation. Soft snow fell onto boots, gloves, and scarves, grounding movement in tactile and temporal reality. Each gesture, pause, and glance became a conscious witness to endurance and atrocity alike. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember. Along the railway tracks leading into the camp, snow-covered wooden sleepers and rusting rails, softening their lines yet highlighting their historical trajectory. The faint tang of iron, wet wood, and cold earth pressed into awareness, a subtle reminder of countless lives transported to uncertainty. Footsteps of modern visitors crunched in rhythm with gusts of wind, blending sound and memory into quiet meditation. Candles placed on nearby stones flickered in the breeze, casting moving shadows across frozen ground. Frost sparkled along rail edges, wooden ties, and surrounding gravel, catching fragmented sunlight and refracting it across faces and snow. Guides explained both historical fact and survivor testimony, ensuring context met emotion with balance and care. Children traced lines in the snow with gloved hands, absorbing scale, texture, and consequence through touch. Every movement along these tracks became both observation and ethical reflection, connecting past horror to present awareness. The air, cold and dense, carried both silence and weight, demanding attention without words. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember. In quiet corners of the camp, memorial plaques and stone markers bore names, numbers, and sparse words, standing resilient against wind, snow, and time. Frost rimmed every engraved letter, glinting faintly under pale winter light, emphasizing permanence within decay. The faint tang of stone, moss, and lingering candle smoke grounded reflection in both tactile and sensory reality. Footsteps approached reverently, pausing before names, touching surfaces, and leaving small stones in homage. Children crouched to examine inscriptions, tracing letters with fingers, absorbing both historical fact and emotional resonance. Guides whispered context, situating personal loss within the enormity of systemic atrocity. Snow accumulated softly on markers, highlighting contrast between fragility and endurance, memory and nature alike. Each act of placement, touch, or observation became ritual, reinforcing continuity of remembrance. Frost glimmered faintly along edges, emphasizing the interplay of presence, absence, and reflection. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember. From above, watchtowers and chimneys cast long, fractured shadows across snow-laden paths, memorials and ruins, creating a mosaic of light, absence, and history. The bitter tang of rusting metal, frozen wood, and distant smoke pressed subtly into perception, marking space with sensory weight. Footsteps of visitors echoed softly, careful and deliberate, as eyes traced contours of buildings, fences, and foundations. Children's voices rose quietly in questions, answered by guides with measured tones, blending awe with historical authority. Frost shimmered across structures, memorial plaques, and rail edges, catching sun and wind in subtle, fractured brilliance. Every photograph taken, every candle lit, and every whispered name reinforced the camp's moral presence in living memory. Snow drifted lightly over pathways once trodden by countless feet in fear and despair, softening lines yet preserving story. Visitors paused, lingered, and reflected, their presence both homage and affirmation of witness. Each gesture, every breath, became an acknowledgement that history endures in both space and conscience. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember. In the final light of day, the camp settled into silence, snow falling in delicate rhythm across ruins, tracks, and memorials alike. Frost glimmered faintly on edges of barbed wire, plaques, and foundations, catching one light in fractured patterns that mirrored memory itself. The faint tang of stone, wood, and candle wax pressed gently into awareness, grounding moral reflection in physical space. Footsteps of late visitors faded into distance, leaving only wind, snow, and quiet contemplation behind. Candles burned low, their flicker casting gentle shadows across memorial stones and frozen ground. Every broken beam, rusted rail, and frozen puddle seemed to hold both absence and testimony simultaneously. Children's gloved hands left small stones upon memorials, joining generations in acts of witness and moral continuity. Frosted windows, sagging timbers, and skeletal ruins absorbed the fading light, emphasizing fragility, endurance, and reflection alike. The camp, silent yet charged with history, stood as both grave and classroom, memorial and warning. The barbed wire still stands, not to hold but to remind. Liberation is never the end, it is the call to remember.